The spring of 1774 did not arrive in Boston with the sweet scent of blooming lilacs. Instead, it arrived with the stench of stagnant harbor water, the metallic tang of muskets being cleaned, and the heavy, cloying aroma of printer's ink. To Silas Thorne, that ink was more than a tool of his trade. It was the lifeblood of a revolution that was currently pulsing through the narrow, cobbled veins of the city. Silas stood in the dim light of Ed's and Gill's print shop on Queen Street. The shop was a cramped, rectangular world of wood and iron. Every surface was coated in a fine layer of dust and dried ink. To an outsider, it was a mess. To Silas, it was a sanctuary. He worked the great press, a massive timber beast that groaned with every pull of the lever. Thwack slab, thwack slab. The rhythm was hypnotic. Silas's shirt was rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle from years of pulling the heavy bar. His hands were permanently stained. The ink had settled into the very lines of his palms, a map of sedition that no amount of scrubbing could erase. "The type is set for the front page, Silas," Benjamin Ed said, leaning over a composing stone. His eyes were red-rimmed from candlelight and lack of sleep. "Sam Adams wants 500 copies by noon. He says the people need to hear about the Port Act before the British patrols start seizing the papers." Silas didn't stop. "The people already feel it, Ben. They don't need a paper to tell them their bellies are empty because the harbor is closed, but they do need to know they aren't alone." He reached for a fresh sheet of parchment. The paper was rough, handmade, and smelled of old rags. As he laid it onto the ink type, he felt a strange sense of power. With one pull of the lever, he could turn a blank sheet into a weapon. That was the ink, the quiet, intellectual force that was beginning to rattle the foundations of the British Empire. The Scarlet Shadow. By mid-morning, Silas was out in the streets, carrying a heavy bundle of broadsides wrapped in oiled leather to protect them from the persistent Boston drizzle. The city was a powder keg. Everywhere he looked, he saw the redcoats, the king's soldiers, standing like bloodstains against the grey stone buildings. The atmosphere was suffocating. Since the Tea Party a few months prior, the British had turned Boston into an open-air prison. The harbor was blocked by massive warships, their cannons pointed directly at the town. Silas walked with his head down, his tricorn hat pulled low. He knew the soldiers looked for the ink monkeys, the apprentices who carried the rebellious words of the Sons of Liberty. As he turned onto King Street, near the Custom House, the crowd thickened. A line of British transport wagons was trying to push through a throng of angry dockworkers. "Make way for the king's business," a sergeant roared, his voice cracking like a whip. "The king has no business here," a voice shouted back from the crowd. Silas slowed his pace, his hand tightening on his bundle. He saw the flash of bayonets. The soldiers were nervous. They were young boys, far from home, staring into the eyes of men who hated them. Then the sound of a carriage broke through the shouting. It was a high society vehicle, painted a deep, obsidian black with gold leaf along the door frames. The horses were thoroughbreds, their coats gleaming despite the damp air. This was the world of the gold, the wealthy loyalists who remained faithful to King George III. The collision. The carriage belonged to Judge Harrison Vance, one of the most hated men in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was a man who believed in the divine right of kings and the inherent lawlessness of the American rabble. The carriage tried to navigate a patch of road where the cobblestones had been torn up for repair. A wheel caught in a deep, muddy rut. The driver, an arrogant man in fine blue livery, lashed the horses. The carriage lurched violently, sending a massive spray of black, icy mud directly into a group of women standing nearby. The crowd erupted. It wasn't just about the mud, it was about the arrogance of the elite. "Get out of the carriage, Tory," a man yelled, stepping forward with a heavy wooden club. The carriage door swung open. Silas expected the judge to emerge with his wig askew and his face purple with rage. Instead, a young woman stepped out. Evelyn Vance was a vision of another world. She wore a gown of pale cream silk under a heavy cloak of forest green. Her face was pale, her features delicate, but set in a mask of startling bravery. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a woman who was used to being obeyed. "Please," she cried out, her voice clear and surprisingly steady. "My driver was reckless, and for that I apologize. There is no need for violence." "Apologies don't fill our plates, miss," someone screamed. A stone flew through the air. It shattered the glass window of the carriage just inches from Evelyn's head. The British sentries nearby reacted instantly. Clack click. The sound of 20 muskets being cocked echoed through the street. The intervention. Sealers acted without thinking. He knew that if a single shot was fired, King Street would become a slaughterhouse. He dropped his bundle of papers and shoved his way through the crowd. He stepped between the angry mob and the carriage, his arms spread wide. "Hold," Sealers shouted. "Look at the uniforms, you fools. They are waiting for a reason to fire. Do you want to die for a broken carriage wheel?" The crowd paused. Sealers was a familiar face, a man of the press, a friend of the Liberty Boys. The anger didn't vanish, but the momentum slowed. Sealers turned to Evelyn. She was staring at him, her amber eyes wide with a mixture of terror and defiance. A small shard of glass had grazed her cheek, and a single drop of blood, bright, vivid blood, traveled down her pale skin. "Get back in the carriage, Miss Vance," Sealers said, his voice a low, urgent rasp, "and tell your driver to keep his whip still." Evelyn looked at the man before her. He was covered in ink. His clothes were worn, and he smelled of sweat and old paper. He was everything her father taught her to despise, a radical, a peasant, a troublemaker. And yet he was the only thing standing between her and a violent end. I can't," she whispered, her voice finally trembling. "The wheel is stuck." Sealers looked down. The wheel was indeed jammed against a heavy stone. Without a word, he moved to the back of the carriage. He put his shoulder against the cold, wet wood. "On 3, he yelled to the driver, "Push." Sealers heaved. He felt the strain in his back and the slick mud beneath his boots. With a sickening slurp, the carriage popped out of the rut. "The ink and the silk." Before the carriage could pull away, Evelyn stepped toward Sealers. She reached into her sleeve and pulled out a small, lace-trimmed handkerchief. It was white, smelling of lavender, a stark contrast to the grime of the street. She reached out and, with a trembling hand, wiped a smudge of ink from Sealers's cheek. "You're bleeding," he said, pointing to her face. "And you're covered in ink," she replied, her voice regaining its edge. She looked at the bundle of papers he had dropped on the ground. One had fallen open. She saw the words, "Tyranny, liberty, and resistance." "My father says people like you are the ruin of this country," she said softly. "My father died in a British debtor's prison, Miss Vance," Sealers countered, his eyes locking onto hers. "So I suppose we both have our reasons for what we believe." The driver snapped the reins, and the carriage began to move. Evelyn retreated inside, but she didn't close the door immediately. She watched Sealers as he stood in the middle of the muddy street, a solitary figure of ink and shadow. Sealers picked up his bundle. He felt the spot on his face where she had touched him. It felt warm, despite the cold rain. The aftermath. That evening, Sealers returned to the print shop. He worked by the light of a single tallow candle. He tried to focus on the ink, on the words that would ignite a nation. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the drop of blood on Evelyn Vance's cheek. He realized then that the coming war wouldn't just be fought on battlefields. It would be fought in the hearts of people who were never meant to meet. He took a scrap of paper and a quill. He didn't write a political pamphlet. Instead, he drew a small, intricate sketch of a carriage wheel stuck in the mud, and beside it, a single, perfect rose. In the Vance mansion on Beacon Hill, Evelyn sat at her vanity. She looked at her reflection. The small scratch on her cheek was already beginning to heal. She looked at her white silk glove, now stained with a thumbprint of black ink from when she had touched the carriage door. She didn't wash it off. Instead, she tucked the glove into her jewelry box, hidden beneath her pearls. The quill had met the flintlock. The ink had met the blood, and in the silence of the Boston night, the story had truly begun. The silence of Beacon Hill. In the grand mansions of Beacon Hill, silence was not merely the absence of noise, It was a curated performance of wealth and loyalty. In the house of Judge Harrison Vance, the silence was heavy, like the velvet drapes that muffled the sounds of a city in turmoil. Evelyn Vance sat at her vanity, her reflection illuminated by a dozen beeswax candles. Outside her window, the night was a bruised purple, and the distant sound of a British sentry's whistle cut through the air. To the rest of the world, she was the golden girl of the Loyalists, a prize to be married off to a high-ranking officer of the Crown. But as she stared into the mirror, she didn't recognize the girl in the silk bodice. She saw a stranger with a smudge of ink on her temple, a smudge that had long been washed away but felt as permanent as a scar. Her father was downstairs, entertaining Colonel Wolfe of the 29th Regiment. Their voices drifted up through the floorboards, low, rumbling tones discussing the necessity of the gallows for the agitators who had turned the harbor into a teapot. "They are children playing with fire," her father's voice boomed, followed by the clink of a crystal decanter against a glass. "And children must be disciplined until they remember who provides their bread." Evelyn felt a hot flush of anger. "We provide the bread," she thought. "The farmers in Lexington, the merchants in the North End, the printers, they are the ones whose labor feeds your fine dinners." She turned to her writing desk. For years, she had used it to write social acceptances and poetry. Tonight, the mahogany surface felt like an altar. She pulled out a fresh sheet of heavy vellum. She dipped her quill into the silver inkwell, her hand trembling. She didn't think of herself as a rebel. She thought of Silas Thorne's hands, blackened, rough, and honest. She thought of the way he had looked at her, not as a judge's daughter, but as a soul capable of understanding the truth. She began to write. She didn't use her name. She signed it Publia, after the Roman defenders of the Republic. The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam, arguments against the closing of the port, the illegality of the quartering acts, and a call for the dignity of the common man. The shadow in the alley. An hour past midnight, the Vance mansion was finally dark. Evelyn slipped out of her room, wearing a common servant's wool cloak over her fine clothes. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, rhythmic drumming that made her feel lightheaded. The streets of Boston were a labyrinth of danger. The redcoats moved in pairs, their lanterns casting long, skeletal shadows against the brick walls. Evelyn moved like a ghost, sticking to the narrow alleyways that smelled of wood smoke and rotting fish. She knew that if she were caught, her father's reputation might save her from the noose, but it would not save her from the social death of a scandal. She reached Queen Street. The windows of Ed's and Gill's print shop were dark, save for a faint, orange glow leaking from a crack in the shutters. She knocked on the back door, 3 quick raps, followed by a long pause, then one more. The door creaked open. A hand reached out, grabbed her arm, and pulled her into the warmth and scent of the shop. "Are you insane?" Silas Thorne hissed, though his eyes were wide with a relief he couldn't hide. He let go of her arm as if burned. "The patrols are doubled tonight. General Gage is looking for any excuse to burn this block to the ground." "I have something," Evelyn said, breathless. She pulled the folded vellum from her cloak. "It's a response to the governor's latest decree. It's legal, Silas. It uses their own laws against them." Silas took the papers, his blackened fingers a stark contrast to the white vellum. He walked over to a small candle burning on the composing stone. As he read, his expression shifted from skepticism to awe. "You wrote this," he whispered. "This isn't just a pamphlet, Evelyn. This is a blade. You've cut right through their excuses." "Will you print it?" she asked, stepping into the light. The golden glow of the candle caught the amber in her eyes, and for a moment, the political fire in the room was replaced by a different kind of heat. Silas looked at the press, the great press that stood like a silent sentinel in the room. "If I print this and they find the source, they won't just arrest you, they'll break you." "They're already breaking us, Silas," she said softly. "They're just doing it slowly enough that we are supposed to thank them for it. Print it." The labor of the night. For the next several hours, the two of them worked in a silence that was thick with unspoken tension. Silas taught her how to set the type. He showed her the California job case, explaining how each letter had its place. "The E is the most used, so it has the largest box," he explained, his voice low and steady. Evelyn's fingers, usually reserved for embroidery and piano keys, fumbled with the tiny lead blocks. Silas stepped behind her to guide her hand. His chest was inches from her back, and she could smell the ink, the salt, and the faint scent of cedar on him. "Careful," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "The P and the Q are mirrors of each other. In this world, you have to mind your P's and Q's, or the message is lost." When the type was set, Silas applied the ink. He moved with a brutal, masculine grace, his muscles rippling under his thin linen shirt as he worked the leather ink balls over the metal type. "Now," he said, stepping back, "pull the lever. This is your voice, Evelyn. Give it weight." Evelyn grasped the heavy wooden handle. She leaned back, using her entire body weight. The press groaned, a deep wooden protest, and then, with a satisfying thump, the ink met the paper. Silas peeled the sheet back. The words were crisp, black, and defiant. "The price of liberty is the blood of the just, but the pen shall be the map to our freedom." Evelyn stared at it. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She looked up at Silas, and the triumph on her face was infectious. He laughed, a rare, genuine sound, and for a moment they weren't a printer and a lady. They were two architects of a new world. The close call. The moment was shattered by the sound of a heavy boot striking the cobblestones outside. "Patrol, 10 yards," a voice whispered from the front of the shop. It was an apprentice keeping watch. Silas didn't hesitate. He blew out the candle, plunged the room into absolute darkness, and grabbed Evelyn's hand. He pulled her toward the back of the shop, where a small crawl space was hidden beneath the floorboards where they kept the extra lead. "Get down," he breathed. They huddled together in the tiny, cramped space. The air was thin and smelled of damp earth. Evelyn was pressed against Silas's side, her head tucked under his chin. She could hear the frantic beating of his heart, or was it hers? Above them, the shop door was rattled. "Open up, King's business," a British voice barked. The heavy thud of boots moved across the floorboards directly above their heads. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, her fingers digging into Silas's arm. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer, his body a shield against the world. "Search the back," the officer ordered. "I smell fresh ink." Evelyn held her breath until her lungs burned. She felt Silas's grip tighten. In that darkness, the danger of the war felt distant compared to the overwhelming reality of the man holding her. After what felt like an eternity, the boots retreated. The door slammed shut, and the shop returned to its heavy, ink-scented silence. The dawn of the rebels. They didn't move for a long time. The intimacy of the hiding spot was harder to leave than the fear. When they finally emerged, the first light of dawn was beginning to turn the sky a pale, sickly gray. Silas helped Evelyn into her cloak, his hands lingering on her shoulders for a second longer than necessary. "You have to go," he said, his voice husky. "The market wagons will be moving soon. You can blend in with the crowds." Evelyn nodded. She reached out and touched his hand, the hand that had guided her through the night. "When will I see you again?" Silas looked at the stack of pamphlets, the seditious words they had birthed in the dark. "When the city starts talking about Publia, I'll be at the Liberty Tree on Thursday. If you can get away, be there." Evelyn slipped out the door and into the mist. She walked back to Beacon Hill, her heart no longer heavy, but soaring. She had left as a daughter of the crown, but she returned as a soldier of the ink. At the breakfast table that morning, her father was in a foul mood. A copy of the pamphlet, still damp, had been found pinned to the door of the custom house. "This Publio," her father hissed, his face red with fury. "Whoever they are, they have the mind of a lawyer and the heart of a traitor. If I find them, Evelyn, I will oversee the hanging myself." Evelyn took a sip of her tea, her hand perfectly steady. Beneath the table, she felt the phantom sensation of Silas's hand in hers. "I'm sure the person who wrote it is long gone, father," she said softly. But as she looked out the window at the rising sun, she knew the fire had only just begun to burn. The ink was dry, the blood was stirring, and she was exactly where she was meant to be. The Whispers of the Green Dragon. By November 1774, the air in Boston was no longer just cold, it was brittle. The city felt like a sheet of glass, ready to shatter at the touch of a single bayonet. Silas Thorne had become more than just a printer's apprentice. He was a midnight courier, a shadow that moved between the taverns and the docks, carrying the secrets of the Sons of Liberty tucked into his boot flaps. The Green Dragon Tavern was the unofficial headquarters of the rebellion. It was a place of thick wood smoke, spilled ale, and low-voiced conspiracies. Silas sat in a dark corner, his hood pulled forward. Across from him sat Paul Revere, the silversmith, whose eyes were sharp with the burden of what was coming. "The British know we have a list of their loyalist informants," Silas, Revere whispered, sliding a leather pouch across the scarred oak table. "They're searching every man who tries to cross the Boston Neck, but this pouch doesn't contain the list. It contains the names of the British officers who are planning to seize the Powder House in Charlestown." Silas took the pouch. "And you want me to get this to the riders in Cambridge?" "You're the only one they don't suspect yet," Revere said. "To them, you're just a printer. Use the old salt wagons. And Silas, if you're caught, burn the papers. Don't let them find the ink." The encounter in the mist. Silas left the tavern and slipped into the fog that rolled off the Atlantic like a funeral shroud. He had a horse tethered near the north end, a sturdy bay that knew the winding alleys as well as he did. As he led the horse toward the city gates, he saw a silhouette that stopped his heart. Standing near the corner of Hanover Street was a carriage, the Vance carriage. Evelyn was there, stepping out to speak with a British sentry. Silas knew he should keep moving, but the magnetic pull of her presence was too strong. He tucked the pouch into his coat and stepped into the light of a nearby street lamp. "Miss Vance," he called out softly. Evelyn spun around, her face pale. She dismissed the sentry with a sharp word and hurried toward Silas. "Silas, what are you doing out? The patrols are looking for a courier. They say a rebel rat stole documents from the governor's office." "I'm just doing my job, Evelyn," he said, his voice a low rumble. He looked at her, realizing this might be the last time he saw her for months. The war was no longer a theoretical debate, it was on their doorstep. "You're carrying it, aren't you?" she whispered, her eyes darting to his coat. "The ink my father spoke of at dinner. Silas, they have snipers on the rooftops tonight. Please go back to the shop." "I can't," Silas said. He reached out, his hand grazing her cheek, the same spot she had once wiped the ink from. "Some things are worth the risk, if I don't see you tomorrow." "Don't say it," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "Just come back to me." She pressed a small object into his hand, a silver locket. "My mother's. It has nothing inside but a prayer. Keep it." The ambush. Silas rode hard toward the Boston Neck, the narrow strip of land that connected the peninsula to the mainland. The fog was his only ally. He could hear the heavy thud of his horse's hooves on the damp earth. "Halt in the name of the king!" The shout came from the darkness above. A flash of gunpowder illuminated the fog. Crack. Silas felt a searing heat bloom in his left shoulder. He gasped, nearly falling from the saddle. He didn't stop. He dug his spurs into the horse, leaning low over the animal's neck. Fire! A volley of musket fire erupted from the roadside. Silas felt another impact, this time in his side. The world began to tilt. The blood he had once spoken of was now hot and sticky, soaking into his linen shirt and the leather pouch he carried. He pushed the horse through the barrier, crashing through the wooden gates as the British soldiers scrambled to reload. He was through. He was in the open country, but the strength was draining out of him like water from a cracked jar. The blood-stained letter. 2 miles outside the city, Silas slumped over the horse's mane. He reached a small, abandoned barn near the marshes. He knew he couldn't go further. He had to get the papers to the next courier, but he also knew he could never return to Boston. He was a marked man. He was a traitor who had survived a British volley. He crawled into the hay, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He pulled out the leather pouch. The papers inside were damp, not with rain, but with his own blood. He pulled a crumpled piece of parchment, and a charcoal stick from his pocket. His hands were shaking, and his vision was blurring. He didn't write about the war. He wrote to the only person who made the war worth winning. Evelyn. The ink on this page is mixed with the price I told you we would have to pay. I am leaving the city, not because I want to, but because I must live to fight another day. They will come to your house. They will ask about the printer. Tell them nothing. I have your locket. It is the only thing keeping the cold away. If the republic we are building is to mean anything, it must be a place where a man like me and a woman like you can stand together without shadows. Until that day, look for my name in the broadsides. I will find my way back to you, even if I have to write our story in the dust of the battlefield. Yours in blood and ink, Sealers. The Discovery. The next morning, the Vance mansion was raided by the 29th Regiment. Judge Vance was outraged, but the soldiers were relentless. They searched every room, looking for the Publier pamphlets and the courier who had escaped the neck. Evelyn stood in the garden, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. A young boy, an apprentice from the print shop, slipped through the hedge. He looked terrified. Without a word, he handed her a folded piece of parchment. It was heavy and stiff. Evelyn opened it. The sight of the dark, reddish-brown stains across the elegant script made her knees buckle. She leaned against a stone fountain, her eyes scanning the desperate, hurried words. Is he dead?" she whispered to the boy. "He got the papers through, miss," the boy sobbed, "but the soldiers followed the blood trail to the barn. He was gone by the time they got there. They say he's headed for the hills." Evelyn looked at the letter. The blood had smeared some of the words, making the ink and blood inseparable. She folded the letter and tucked it into her corset, right against her heart. Her father walked out onto the veranda, his face a mask of cold fury. "They didn't find him, Evelyn, but they found his blood. The rebel is as good as dead." Evelyn looked at her father, and for the first time she didn't see a protector. She saw the enemy. "No, father," she said, her voice like cold steel. "He's not dead, he's just become a legend." The departure. That night Evelyn sat in her room. She didn't cry. She took her quill and a fresh bottle of ink. She looked at Sealers's blood-stained letter and began to write. She wasn't just writing pamphlets anymore. She was writing a ledger, a record of every British movement she saw from her father's dinner table. Sealers had fled into the dark, but he had left the fire with her. The midnight courier was gone, but the spy in silk was born. The war had truly begun. The Gilded Silence. The winter of 1774 descended upon Boston like a heavy, suffocating shroud of grey. The harbour was a forest of British masts, and the streets were a grid of scarlet and steel. In the Vance mansion, the fires in the hearths burned bright, but Evelyn Vance had never felt more cold. Sealers was gone. The midnight courier had vanished into the mist of the Massachusetts countryside, leaving behind nothing but a blood-stained letter and a void in Evelyn's soul that no amount of silk or social standing could fill. Her father, Judge Harrison Vance, celebrated the disappearance of the rebel printer as a victory for the crown, unaware that the very rebellion he loathed was now breathing under his own roof. Evelyn played her part with terrifying precision. She attended the balls, she poured the tea for General Gage, and she smiled at the young lieutenants who boasted of how quickly they would crush the peasant uprising. But every morning, her first act was to check the Boston Gazette and the Massachusetts Spy. She wasn't looking for the news, she was looking for him. The Apprentice and the Cypher. The secret pact was born in the back room of a small apothecary in the North End. Evelyn had slipped away under the guise of buying peppermint for her nerves. There, she met Thomas, the young apprentice Sealers had left behind to manage what remained of the secret printing network. "He lives, Miss Evelyn," Thomas whispered, his hands tucked into a ragged apron. "But he is far to the west with the militias. He cannot write to you directly. Every letter is a death warrant if the redcoats intercept it." "Then we must find a way that doesn't look like writing," Evelyn said, her voice sharp with desperation. She had spent weeks studying the lost and found and legal notice sections of the newspapers. They were filled with mundane advertisements, stolen horses, runaway servants, and sales of West Indian rum. Look here, she pointed to a notice about a lost silver snuff box. What if we use a book cipher? We both have a copy of the same book, the Book of Common Prayer, perhaps, or something more poetic. Sealers has a copy of Paradise Lost, Thomas said with a faint smile. He took it with him. He said it reminded him of the world we are trying to build. Then Paradise Lost it is, Evelyn decided. The first word of my message will correspond to the page number, the second to the line, the third to the word count. We will hide the numbers in the prices of the goods listed in the advertisements. It was a covenant of shadows, a promise that no matter how much blood was spilled, the ink would remain their bridge. The first advertisement. A week later, a small, unassuming notice appeared in the corner of the Boston Gazette. Found a stray bay mare near the Roxbury line. Owner may claim by paying the cost of feed, which amounts to 4 shillings, 12 pence, and 9 farthings. Contact the livery near the Elm. To the British authorities, it was a common notice. To Silas Thorne, sitting by a campfire in the freezing woods of Worcester, it was a lifeline. He pulled his tattered copy of Milton's Paradise Lost from his pack. His fingers, cracked from the cold and still scarred from the musket fire at the neck, turned the pages with reverence. Page 4, line 12, word 9, the word was safe. Silas let out a breath he felt he had been holding for a month. He looked at the fire, the orange light reflecting in his eyes. He wasn't just a soldier now, he was a man being haunted by a ghost in a silk dress. He took a charred stick from the fire and on the back of a piece of dried bark began to work out his response. He needed to tell her where he was. He needed to tell her that the militias were gathering. But more than that, he needed to tell her that the locket she gave him was the only thing keeping his heart from turning to stone. The danger of the gaze. Back in Boston, the game was becoming more perilous. Judge Vance had become suspicious of Evelyn's sudden interest in the daily papers. You spend an inordinate amount of time reading the advertisements, Evelyn, he remarked one morning over breakfast, his eyes narrowing behind his spectacles. Are you looking for a new carriage, or perhaps a runaway slave? I am looking for a specific set of lace, father, Evelyn replied, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The kind that was imported from London before the blockade. I find the local weavers to be lacking. HMPH, a waste of time, the judge grumbled, returning to his tea. The only thing you'll find in those papers soon is the list of men we are going to hang. Evelyn kept her face a mask of porcelain indifference, but beneath the table, her hands were clenched so tight her nails drew blood. She was living 2 lives. By day, she was the dutiful daughter. By night, she was a cryptographer of the revolution. She began to include intelligence in her codes. When a British officer mentioned a shipment of gunpowder moving to Castle William, she would translate it into a notice about fine black pepper. When she heard of a planned raid on a local farm, she would advertise for lost sheep. She was no longer just Silas's lover. She was his eyes inside the lion's den. The message of the heart. In late December, Silas managed to get a response through. It was hidden in a loyalist paper, the ultimate irony. Wanted, a tutor for a young gentleman, must be proficient in the classics. Salary of £18, 6 shillings, 7 pence. Inquire at the sign of the Anchor. Evelyn locked her bedroom door and pulled out her book. Her hands shook so violently she could barely turn the pages. Evelyn collapsed onto her bed, the paper pressed to her lips. In the world of blood and ink, these few words were more precious than all the gold in the king's treasury. Silas was alive, and he was still hers. But the covenant of shadows had a price. The more she communicated, the more the shadows closed in. She was starting to notice a man in a brown coat following her when she went to the market. She noticed that her desk had been searched, the papers shifted just an inch from where she had left them. The breaking point. The chapter concludes with a moment of high tension. Evelyn is at a gala, dancing with a British major named Sterling. He is a clever man, with eyes that seem to see through her silk facade. "You have a very particular way of looking at the newspapers, Miss Vance," Sterling whispered as they spun across the ballroom floor. "I've noticed you always turn to the back pages first. Most ladies prefer the fashion news from London. You seem interested in the prices of stray horses." Evelyn felt a surge of cold terror. "I have always had a head for figures, Major. My father says it is my most unladylike quality." "Is that so?" Sterling smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "I find that people who have a head for figures often have a heart for secrets. I shall have to keep a closer eye on your horse trading, Evelyn." Evelyn realized then that the Covenant of Shadows was no longer a secret. The enemy was watching the ink. She needed to warn sealers, but how could she send a message when every word she wrote was being weighed by the hangman? As the music swelled, Evelyn looked out the window at the dark Boston night. Somewhere out there, Sealers was waiting for her next advertisement. She knew that the next message she sent would have to be her most dangerous one yet. The ink was becoming as dangerous as the blood. The drumbeat in the dark. The transition from ink to blood did not happen with a grand fanfare. It happened in the shivering, pre-dawn hours of April 19, 1775. Sealers Thorne stood outside Buckman Tavern in Lexington, his fingers wrapped around the cold steel of a Brown Bess flintlock musket. The weight of the weapon was clumsy and alien compared to the familiar, balanced pull of a printing press lever. For months, he had printed words about natural rights and standing against tyranny. Now, those words felt thin and fragile against the biting wind that swept across the Massachusetts countryside. Around him stood 76 other men, farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers. They were the Minutemen, a title that had sounded heroic in the taverns of Boston, but felt terrifyingly small under the shadow of the encroaching British Empire. "Steady, Sealers," whispered Jonas, a cooper who had helped Sealers find a place to sleep when he first fled the city. Jonas was a man of 60, his face a map of deep-set wrinkles, yet his hands were steady. "The ink is dry, lad. Today we see if the parchment holds." Sealers reached into his pocket and touched the silver locket Evelyn had given him. He thought of her in Boston, likely asleep in her silk sheets, unaware that the world was about to catch fire. He wondered if she had seen his last coded message. He wondered if he would ever have the chance to write her another. The red tide. Back in Boston, the night had been a cacophony of hushed movements and clanking armor. Evelyn Vance had stood at her window, hidden behind the heavy velvet drapes, watching as the regulars, 700 of them, marched toward the docks. The sight was hypnotic and horrifying. In the moonlight, their scarlet coats looked like a river of blood flowing through the gray streets. She knew where they were going. She had heard the whispers at her father's table, Concord, the powder, the leaders. She had spent the night in a state of silent prayer, her hand resting on the blood-stained letter Sealers had left her months ago. Every time she heard a musket butt hit the cobblestones outside, she felt a phantom pain in her own shoulder. "God keep you, Sealers," she whispered into the dark. "If the ink cannot save us, let the shadows hide you." She knew that by dawn, the Covenant of Shadows they had built would be tested by the harshest light of all, her father. Judge Vance was already awake, packing the study downstairs. He was waiting for the news of a decisive victory that would end the nonsense of rebellion once and for all. He did not know that his daughter was a silent witness to the funeral of the world he loved. The stand on Lexington Green. At 5:00 a.m., the mist was so thick on Lexington Green that Sealers could barely see the white spire of the meeting house. Then, out of the gray, came the sound. Tramp, tramp, tramp. It was the sound of 1,000 boots moving in perfect, mechanical unison. It was the sound of a machine that had conquered half the globe. Captain John Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War, stood before his ragtag militia. He was coughing, a harsh, tubercular sound, but his voice was steady. "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Sealers felt the blood rushing in his ears, a deafening roar that drowned out the chirping of the morning birds. The British vanguard appeared through the fog. Major Pitcairn sat atop his horse, a silhouette of ultimate authority. "Disperse, you rebels," Pitcairn roared, his sword flashing in the dim light. "Lay down your arms and disperse." Sealers looked at the men around him. They were terrified. Some were shaking so hard their muskets rattled, but no one moved. They stood on their own soil, feet planted in the dew-soaked grass. Sealers thought of the ink, the pamphlets he had printed that said a man was a king in his own home. He tightened his grip on the flintlock. The shot heard round the world. What happened next was a blur of chaos and sensory overload. A shot rang out, no one knew from where. It was a sharp, lonely crack that shattered the silence of the New England morning. "Fire, by God, fire!" a British officer screamed. The world disappeared behind a wall of white smoke. The British regulars, trained to kill with the efficiency of a clockwork engine, leveled their muskets and fired a devastating volley. Sealers heard the lead balls whistling past his ears, a sound like angry hornets. Beside him, Jonas, the old cooper, let out a soft "oh" and crumpled to the ground. Sealers watched in horror as blood, vivid, hot, and real, began to soak into the green grass. "This is the blood," Sealers thought, his mind reeling. "The ink didn't tell me it would smell like this. It didn't tell me it would sound like men screaming for their mothers." He raised his musket, his eyes stinging from the sulphurous smoke. He saw a red-coated figure through the haze and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, a familiar bruise meeting a new one. He didn't know if he hit anything. He couldn't see. He could only hear the thunder of the second British volley and the screams of the dying. "Retreat," Captain Parker shouted. "Into the woods, retire." Sealers grabbed the back of a younger boy's coat, dragging him toward the stone walls that lined the road. He looked back once. The green was no longer green. It was dotted with scarlet coats and the dark, crumpled forms of his neighbors. The realization of war. As the sun rose higher, Sealers found himself crouching behind a stone wall on the road to Concord. His face was blackened with powder, and his hands, once stained with ink, were now stained with the soot of the flintlock and the blood of Jonas, which had sprayed onto his sleeve when the old man fell. He pulled a small scrap of paper from his pouch, a piece of a pamphlet he had been carrying. He looked at the words, "The inherent right to life and liberty." He took a lead ball from his pouch and used it to scratch a single, jagged line across the text. The philosophy was gone. The debate was over. The British had fired on their own people. He realized then that the letters he sent to Evelyn through the newspaper advertisements would no longer suffice. "Safe" and "beloved" were words for a world that died on the Lexington Green. He needed to tell her the truth, that the war was not a grand adventure, but a messy, ugly business of lead and bone. The Echo in Boston. By noon, the news reached Boston. A rider had come through the back ways, and the city erupted in a frenzy of panic and celebration. Evelyn was in the parlor when her father burst in, his face jubilant. "They broke them, Evelyn. The rabble fled at Lexington like rats from a burning barn. The rebellion is over before it could truly begin." Evelyn felt a cold, hollow sensation in her chest. She looked at her father's smiling face and felt a sudden, violent urge to scream. She knew Sealers was out there. She knew he wouldn't have run because he was a coward. He would have run to fight again. She excused herself and fled to her room. She pulled out a fresh bottle of ink and a quill. Her hand was shaking so badly, she spilled a drop of black ink onto her white silk skirt. She stared at the stain. It looked like a hole in the world. She began to write a new cipher, but this one was different. It wasn't for the newspaper. It was for the secret couriers she knew still operated in the shadows. "The green is stained," she wrote, her tears blurring the ink. "The first volley has been fired. I am no longer a witness. I am a participant. Tell the printer that if he lives, the silk is ready to become a shroud or a flag. I wait for the sign." The aftermath. The chapter ends with Sealers standing on a hill overlooking the road back to Boston. He watches as the British regulars, now bloodied and harried by the invisible militia snipers, retreat toward the city. He reaches into his coat and pulls out Evelyn's locket. It is dented, perhaps by a piece of shrapnel or a fall, but it is still whole. He looks at his hands, blackened, scarred, and trembling. He knows that the love story written in blood and ink has moved into its most dangerous phase. The ink provided the map, but the blood would provide the path. "I'm coming back, Evelyn," he whispered to the wind, "but I'm not the man who left." He turned away from the smoke of Lexington and began the long march toward the camp at Cambridge. He was a soldier now, and the only ink he cared about was the kind that could tell her he was still breathing. The migration of the Loyalists. By the summer of 1776, Boston had become a ghost town for the British, and New York City had become their glittering fortress. Judge Harrison Vance had moved his household to a grand townhouse on Wall Street, fleeing the rebel contagion of Massachusetts. New York was a city of contrasts, half charred by fires, half decorated in the finery of the British Empire. To Evelyn, it felt like a gilded cage. She was no longer just a judge's daughter. She was a celebrated beauty of the Loyalist social circle, a woman whose presence was requested at every gala and military ball. But beneath her powdered wigs and silk gowns, Evelyn was a hollow shell. Her only connection to the world of ink was the coded newspaper clippings she kept sewn into the lining of her corsets and the memory of Celia's Thorne's face through the Lexington mist. She had heard rumors of the Continental Army's struggles, of a printer-turned-soldier who had become a legend among the Maryland line. She had to believe it was him. She had to believe the blood hadn't claimed him yet. The invitation to treason. The invitation arrived on thick, cream-colored cardstock, embossed with the royal seal. The commander-in-chief requests the honor of Miss Evelyn Vance's presence at the Victory Gala at the Fraunces Tavern Ballroom. Victory, her father spat with a grim smile at the breakfast table. They call it victory, yet Washington still breathes. Evelyn, you will go. You will dance with the generals. You will remind them that New York remains a pillar of the crown. I will go, father, Evelyn said, her voice a calm mask. I will do my duty. Her duty, however, was not to the king. 2 nights prior, a butcher's boy had delivered a leg of mutton to their kitchen. Tucked inside the bone was a sliver of paper. The fleet moves at dawn. We need the destination. The ink depends on you. The transformation. The evening of the ball required a transformation that felt like donning a suit of armor. Evelyn's maid, a quiet girl who Evelyn suspected was also a sympathizer, spent 3 hours preparing her. Her hair was piled high in the pompadour style, dusted with white flour and adorned with miniature silk roses. Her gown was a masterpiece of French brocade, a deep, bruised crimson that reminded her painfully of the blood on Celia's last letter. As she looked in the mirror, she saw a stranger. This was the traitor. To her father, she was loyal to the crown. To the rebels, she was a spy. To herself, she was a woman trying to write a happy ending with a pen made of secrets. She tucked a small, sharpened pencil and a scrap of silk into the hidden pocket of her hoop skirt. The Lion's Den. The ballroom at Fraunces Tavern was a dizzying display of opulence and arrogance. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, roasted meats, and the underlying metallic tang of the hundreds of swords hanging from the waists of British officers. Evelyn moved through the crowd like a swan in a shark tank. She smiled at Major Sterling, the man who had suspected her in Boston, and laughed at the dull jokes of Colonel Tarleton. Her ears, however, were tuned to the frequencies of war. "The girl is a jewel, Harrison," she heard General Howe remark to her father near the punch bowl. "A loyal jewel, General," her father replied, his chest swelling with pride. Evelyn drifted toward a group of high-ranking naval officers huddled in a corner, their voices lowered. She fanned herself languidly, leaning against a velvet-covered pillar as if faint from the heat. "The winds are favorable," Admiral Grave whispered, unaware of the Loyalist socialite mere inches away. "We bypass the Jersey coast. The hammer falls on Philadelphia by Tuesday. If we take the Congress, the rebellion dies in the cradle." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. Philadelphia, the Continental Army was regrouping there. Celia's might be there. The Dance of Shadows. "May I have this dance, Miss Vance?" She turned to find Major Sterling standing before her. His eyes were as sharp as ever, scanning her face for a flicker of the publia he had glimpsed in Boston. "It would be my honor, Major," she lied. The orchestra began a minuet, a structured mathematical dance that required perfect poise. As they spun, Sterling leaned in close. "You seem distracted, Evelyn. Is the New York air not to your liking, or perhaps you miss the printing presses of Boston?" "I miss the peace, Major," she replied, her voice steady. "The war has made us all a bit restless, hasn't it?" "Indeed, but the war is nearly over. We sail for the southern capital soon, a final blow to the head of the snake." "Is that so?" she asked, tilting her head with feigned innocence. "I heard a rumor at dinner that we were heading for the Hudson." Sterling chuckled, a cold, dry sound. "Let the rebels think that. While they watch the river, we take the sea. Philadelphia will be ours before the week is out." Evelyn had it, the confirmation she needed. The cost of the ink. Halfway through the dance, the ballroom doors burst open. A mud-splattered messenger ran toward General Howe. The music faltered. The room fell silent as the general read the dispatch. "A skirmish in the north," Howe shouted. "A group of rebel scouts tried to infiltrate the docks. They've been pushed back, but one was captured. A man found with seditious materials." Evelyn's blood turned to ice. She thought of sealers. She thought of the ink they had shared. "What materials, General?" her father asked, stepping forward. "Pamphlets," Howe spat, "written by that ghost, Publia. It seems the writer followed us from Boston." The room erupted in murmurs of outrage. Sterling turned his gaze back to Evelyn, his grip on her hand tightening until it hurt. "You look pale, my dear," Sterling whispered. "Does the mention of Publia distress you?" "The heat, Major," she gasped. "I must have air." She tore herself away from him and hurried toward the balcony. She needed to get the message out. She needed to tell the rebellion that the fleet was moving to Philadelphia, and she needed to find out if the captured man was Sealers. The silent message. Standing in the shadows of the balcony, Evelyn pulled the scrap of silk and the pencil from her skirt. By the light of the moon reflecting off the Hudson River, she wrote 3 words in a tiny, cramped hand: "Sea Flight Philly." She looked down at the street below. The butcher's boy was there, waiting in the darkness as promised. She rolled the silk into a tiny ball and dropped it. It fell like a falling star, disappearing into the boy's outstretched hand. She stepped back into the ballroom just as her father approached. "There you are, Evelyn. We are leaving. The general has business to attend to. It seems the war is calling for more blood tonight." As she walked out of the ballroom, Evelyn looked at the officers, the silk, and the gold. She realized that she was no longer just a girl in love. She was a weapon. The ballroom was her battlefield, and her words were her bayonets. But as the carriage rattled back toward Wall Street, she clutched her locket and whispered a name into the dark. "Sealers, please don't let it be you in that cell." The blood was getting closer, and the ink was becoming a shroud. The geography of longing. By the autumn of 1776, the American colonies were no longer a collection of provinces. They were a scorched map of longing. For Silas Thorne, now a sergeant in the Maryland line, the war had become a repetitive cycle of mud, hunger, and the sharp, metallic scent of gunpowder. He was miles away from the cobblestones of Boston and the glittering danger of New York, stationed in a temporary camp along the Delaware River. For Evelyn Vance, the miles were not just physical, they were ideological. Living in the heart of occupied New York, she was surrounded by the enemy, her every move watched by Major Sterling and her own father. The only bridge between these two worlds was the ink. Their correspondence was a masterpiece of deception. To a British interceptor, their letters appeared to be mundane exchanges between a loyalist socialite and a distant cousin regarding the sale of livestock or the shipment of wool. But hidden within the structure of the sentences, using the Paradise Lost book cipher they had established, lay a second, truer language. The anatomy of a secret. Sealers sat by a flickering campfire, his fingers cracked from the early frost. He held a piece of scavenged parchment, his only writing desk a flat stone balanced on his knees. He didn't write as a soldier. He wrote as a man trying to keep his soul from evaporating. "The sheep in the valley are restless, cousin," his letter began, a code for the movement of the Continental Army. But then he shifted to the cipher. He chose his words carefully, counting the letters and lines. Page 42, line 15, word 3, dreaming. Page 12, line 8, word 21, your. Page 88, line 2, word 5, voice. As he wrote, the sounds of the camp, the coughing of sick men, the sharpening of bayonets, faded away. In his mind, he was back in the print shop, the scent of lavender and ink filling his senses. He remembered the smudge of ink he had left on her temple, a mark of ownership that the war could never wash away. The Spy's Sanctuary. In New York, Evelyn received the letter via a circuitous route, from a blacksmith in Jersey to a laundrywoman who serviced the British barracks, and finally, tucked inside a basket of soiled linens delivered to the Vance Manor. She locked her door, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. She pulled her tattered copy of Milton's Paradise, lost from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard. Decoding the letter was a slow, agonizingly beautiful process. Each word she uncovered felt like a touch. "I am dreaming of your voice," she whispered to the empty room, the words a balm to her frayed nerves. She responded that night, her quill scratching fiercely against the paper. She gave him the intelligence he needed, the number of British frigates in the harbor, the morale of the Hessian mercenaries, but she also gave him her heart. "The garden in New York is cold, sealers," she wrote in the hidden layer of the text, "but I keep the locket you touched against my skin. It is the only part of me that is still free." The intimacy of the ink. Their love grew deeper in this distance than it ever could have in the safety of Boston. Without the physical distractions of touch or the social constraints of their classes, they became acquainted with each other's minds. Sealers wrote to her about the blood, the horror of seeing men die for a word like liberty. He confessed his fears that he was becoming a man she wouldn't recognize, a man with hard eyes and a heart of flint. Evelyn wrote back, her ink serving as a mirror for his fading humanity. She reminded him of the printer's apprentice who believed that words could move mountains. She told him that she loved the soldier, but she was waiting for the printer. The narrow escape. The danger of their correspondence reached a breaking point when Major Sterling paid an unannounced visit to the Vance home. Evelyn was in the middle of decoding a letter when his boots thundered on the stairs. She barely had time to shove the book and the letter into her sewing basket, covering them with a half-finished embroidery of a willow tree. "You seem flushed, Evelyn," Sterling said, his eyes scanning the room like a hawk. "Reading the scriptures, perhaps?" "Seeking peace where I can find it, Major," she replied, her hand resting on the basket. Sterling walked to her desk, picking up her quill. He looked at the tip, still wet with ink. "You write a great deal for someone with so few friends left in this city." "I write to my aunts in London," she lied, her voice as smooth as silk. "They worry about the rebellion in the colonies." Sterling set the quill down. "Be careful, my dear. The ink is often more treacherous than the sword. I have seen many a neck broken because of a poorly chosen word." After he left, Evelyn collapsed. She realized that the cipher of the heart was also a cipher of death. Every letter Sealers sent was a gift, but it was also a threat. The final word. The chapter concludes with a moment of quiet spiritual union. Hundreds of miles apart, both Sealers and Evelyn look at the moon, the same silver orb reflecting off the Delaware River and the Hudson. Sealers touches the locket, Evelyn touches the letter. They had learned that love was not just a feeling, it was an act of resistance. In a world of blood and ink, their correspondence was the only thing that remained pure. "Always," Sealers whispered to the night air. "Always," Evelyn breathed in her lonely room. The war would continue, the blood would flow, but the ink had bound them in a covenant that no army could break. The Valley of the Shadow. Winter at Valley Forge in 1777 was not a season, it was an adversary. It didn't just bite the skin, it gnawed at the spirit until there was nothing left but the hollow ache of survival. For Silas Thorne, the blood and ink of the Revolution had frozen into a brittle, icy landscape of despair. The Continental Army was a skeleton of its former self. Men lived in damp, log huts that smelled of wood smoke, wet wool, and the metallic tang of sickness. Silas sat on a pile of frozen straw, his feet wrapped in tattered rags. His boots had long since disintegrated on the march from Philadelphia. His toes were a frightening shade of blue, a color that reminded him of the ink he used to master, now turned into the hue of frostbite. Food was a memory. The fire cake, a tasteless mixture of flour and water baked over an open flame, was their only sustenance. Silas watched his men, the remnants of the Maryland line, stare into the embers with hollow eyes. "The ink is dry, Silas," whispered a young soldier named Caleb, his voice trembling with a cough that sounded like dry leaves. "Washington promises supplies, but all we get is more snow. Why do we stay?" Silas reached into his coat, his hand trembling. Beneath the layers of scavenged wool, he felt the crinkle of parchment. "We stay because of what is written, Caleb," Silas replied, though his own voice was a raspy ghost of itself. "Not on the orders, but in the heart. The only warmth." Every night, when the wind howled through the chinks in the log walls, Silas would pull out the letters from Evelyn. They were his only fuel. He didn't read them with his eyes. He knew every word by heart. He read them with his fingertips. One letter in particular, dated from the month the British took Philadelphia, was his sanctuary. "The winter will be long, my soldier," Evelyn had written in her elegant, sloping hand. "But remember that the sun does not forget the earth, even when the clouds are thick. I am with you in every breath of frost." In the darkness of Valley Forge, Silas could almost smell her lavender perfume over the stench of the camp. He closed his eyes and imagined her in a warm parlor, her face lit by a roaring fire. The thought should have made him bitter, but instead it gave him a reason to survive. If he died here, in this frozen valley, the ink would die with him. Their story would be unfinished, a book slammed shut in the middle of a sentence. The sacrifice of the silk. Back in occupied Philadelphia, where the British were wintering in luxury, Evelyn Vance was fighting her own war against the cold. She was forced to attend dinners where British officers boasted about the starving rats at Valley Forge. "They will be gone by spring, Judge," Major Sterling said, sipping a fine Madeira in the Vances' borrowed dining room. "The snow is doing what our bayonets couldn't. Nature is a loyalist, it seems." Evelyn felt a surge of nausea. She looked at the feast on the table, the roasted pheasant, the buttered greens, and thought of Silas eating flour and ash. That night she made a dangerous decision. She began to dismantle her world. She took her finest silk petticoats and wool shawls, items that would have cost a year's wages for a laborer, and began to tear them into strips. She wasn't destroying them, she was preparing a shipment. She coordinated with a local Quaker woman who had a pass to travel outside the city to check on her ailing sister. Tucked inside the crates of charity blankets were the remains of Evelyn's wardrobe, along with a secret message written on a scrap of linen. "I cannot send you the sun, Silas, but I send you my skin in the form of these silks. Wrap them around your wounds. Let them be the bridge that brings you home." The arrival of the Silk Ghost. 2 weeks later, a wagon arrived at the edge of the Valley Forge camp. The supplies were meager, mostly old clothes and a few sacks of grain, but to the starving men, it was a miracle. Silas was called to help unload the crates. As he pulled out a heavy wool blanket, a piece of crimson silk fell into the snow. He froze. He recognized the fabric. It was from the dress Evelyn had worn at the last ball in Boston. He clutched the silk to his chest, the tears freezing on his cheeks. To the other soldiers, it was just a rag. To Silas, it was a piece of her. He shared the wool with Caleb and the others, but the silk he kept. He wrapped it around his neck, tucked beneath his coat, a secret banner of love in a valley of death. The breaking of the ice. The chapter reaches its climax when a fever breaks out in Silas's hut. Caleb, the young boy, is fadding fast. Silas, himself weak and delirious, stays awake through the night, whispering the words from Evelyn's letters to the boy. "Listen to the ink, Caleb," Silas whispered. "She says the spring is coming. She says the fields will be green again." He used the crimson silk to wipe the sweat from the boy's brow. In that moment, the blood of the war and the ink of the letters met in the silk of her sacrifice. It was a trifecta of devotion that defied the British Empire and the winter itself. By morning, the boy's fever had broken. Silas stood outside the hut, watching the first hint of a sunrise. The ice on the Schuylkill River was beginning to crack, a sound like a musket shot, but full of hope. The ghost of a promise. The chapter concludes with Silas finding a stub of charcoal and a piece of birch bark. He cannot send a letter back through the lines easily, but he writes anyway, a message to the wind and the woman who saved his life. "The hope was frozen, Evelyn, but your ink melted the ice. I am still here. I am still yours. The winter did not win." He tucked the bark into his pocket, next to the silver locket. He was thinner, his hair was graying at the temples, and his hands would never be steady again. But as he looked at the men around him, now wrapping themselves in the charity Evelyn had sent, he knew that the Continental Army had not died. It had merely been forged. The winter of frozen hopes was ending. The spring of fire was about to begin. The breath of the Hudson. The spring of 1778 did not bring warmth. It brought a thick, claustrophobic fog that clung to the Hudson River Valley like a damp shroud. For Silas Thorne, the fog was a sanctuary. Now a seasoned scout for the Continental Army, he moved through the woods with the predatory grace of a man who had forgotten the feel of a printing press and learned only the weight of a long rifle. He was deep in neutral ground, the lawless stretch of Westchester County between the American lines in the north and the British-occupied New York City to the south. This was the territory of the skinners and cowboys, marauders who changed their loyalty with the wind. But Silas wasn't hunting marauders. He was on a scouting mission to verify reports of a British troop movement toward the Vance estate, which served as a summer retreat for Judge Harrison Vance and a frequent billet for high-ranking redcoat officers. For Silas, this wasn't just a mission, it was a pilgrimage. For 2 years, he had lived through blood and ink. Now he hungered for the skin, to see the woman who had kept his heart beating through the frozen hell of Valley Forge. The Sentinel in the Mist. The Vance estate was a sprawling manor of white stone, currently surrounded by the white wall of the fog. British sentries paced the perimeter, their scarlet coats dimmed to a dull, bruised purple in the gloom. Silas lay in the tall grass of the orchard, his face blackened with charcoal. He watched the house through his spyglass. Every time a figure moved past a window, his pulse hammered against his ribs. Then he saw her. Evelyn emerged onto the stone terrace, wrapped in a heavy velvet cloak. She looked thinner, her face a pale moon against the grey sky. She was alone, staring out into the fog as if she could sense his eyes upon her. She began to walk toward the edge of the garden, near the line where the manicured lawn met the wild, untamed woods. Silas knew it was a trap of the heart. To move now was to risk everything, the mission, his life, and her safety. But the covenant of shadows screamed for a moment of light. He let out a low, melodic whistle, the call of a whippoorwill. It was a sound they had practiced in the backrooms of the Boston print shop years ago. Evelyn froze. She didn't turn around immediately. She was too smart for that. She paused, adjusted her cloak, and then slowly walked toward the thicket of laurel bushes where Silas was hidden. The dangerous embrace. "Silas," she whispered, her voice barely a tremor in the wind. "Don't look at the woods, Evelyn," he rasped from the shadows. "Keep walking toward the old well." She obeyed, her heart thundering so loudly she feared the sentries would hear it. When she reached the shadows of the stone well house, a pair of strong, ink-stained, and battle-scarred hands pulled her into the darkness. The reunion was not like the poems. There was no graceful waltz. It was a desperate, gasping collision of two souls who had been starving for each other. Silas pulled her against his chest, the rough wool of his scout's tunic scratching her delicate skin. He smelled of pine needles, wet earth, and old smoke. "You're alive," she sobbed into his neck, her hands clutching his face. "The letters, I didn't know if they were reaching a ghost." "I am a ghost," Silas whispered, kissing her brow, her eyes, her lips. "But your ink kept me from fading away." For 5 minutes, the war vanished. There were no loyalists, no rebels, no king, and no Congress. There was only the heat of their breath in the cold fog and the desperate pressure of their hands. Silas felt the locket beneath his shirt, pressed between their beating hearts. The snap of the flintlock. The moment was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic crunch of boots on gravel. "Miss Vance, are you out there?" It was the voice of Major Sterling. He was closer than they realized, his silhouette appearing through the fog like a demon in a dream. Silas reacted with the instinct of a soldier. He pushed Evelyn behind the stone pillar of the well and leveled his rifle toward the approaching figure. "No, Silas, if you kill him, they'll burn the house with me inside," Evelyn hissed. "Evelyn," Sterling called again, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He was 10 paces away. "It is far too damp for a stroll. Your father is asking for you." Evelyn stepped out from behind the well, her face a mask of perfect, icy composure. "I am here, Major. I thought I heard a stray dog in the orchard. I was merely investigating." Sterling stopped. He looked at her, then his gaze shifted to the well house. He noticed the mud on the hem of her gown and a single, dark smudge on the white stone where Silas's blackened hand had rested. "A dog, you say?" Sterling's voice turned dangerously smooth. He drew his pistol. "Then let us see if the dog has teeth." The flight through the fog. Sterling lunged toward the well. Silas didn't fire. The sound would bring the entire regiment down on them. Instead, he swung the butt of his rifle, catching Sterling in the chest and sending him sprawling into the mud. "Run, Evelyn, get to the house," Silas roared. But Sterling was already shouting, "Guards, to the well, an assassin!" The fog erupted with the sounds of whistles and the heavy running of feet. Silas grabbed Evelyn's hand one last time. "The bridge at Phillips Manor, Friday. If I make it, I'll leave a sign." He dove into the fog just as a volley of musket fire lit up the grey air. Crack, crack, crack. The lead balls whistled through the laurel bushes, tearing the leaves to shreds. Evelyn stood her ground, screaming in feigned terror to distract the soldiers. "He went toward the river. I saw him. He went toward the river." She pointed in the opposite direction of Silas's escape. The redcoats, blinded by the mist, charged toward the water, their bayonets gleaming. The cost of the glimpse. Silas ran until his lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. He used the fog as his cloak, disappearing into the rocky ravines of the Hudson Highlands. He had escaped, but the mission was compromised, and Sterling's suspicion was now a certainty. Evelyn was hauled back to the house by her father, who was trembling with rage. "You were with him, weren't you?" Judge Vance roared, throwing her into the study. "The printer, the ghost." "I don't know what you mean, father," she said, her voice trembling but her eyes defiant. Sterling entered the room, wiping mud from his scarlet coat. He held something in his hand, a small, torn scrap of crimson silk that had snagged on the well-house stone. Silas's banner from Valley Forge. "He was here, Harrison," Sterling said, his eyes burning with a cold, murderous light. "And your daughter was in his arms. The ink has turned to treason. From this moment on, Evelyn, you are a prisoner in this house." The ghost's vow. The chapter ends with Silas standing on a high ridge, looking back at the dim lights of the Vance estate. He is bleeding from a shallow graze on his arm, and his heart is heavy with the knowledge that he has placed Evelyn in more danger than ever before. He looks at his hand, the hand that had just held hers. The charcoal was gone, washed away by the damp fog, but he could still feel her warmth. The love story written in blood and ink had almost ended in the mud. The reunion was over, the fog was lifting, and the real war, the one that would decide if they ever touched again, was only just beginning. "Friday," he whispered. "I'll be there, Evelyn, dead or alive, I'll be there." The architecture of deception. By the late spring of 1778, The Vance Manor in New York had become a tomb for the living. Following the ghost in the fog incident, Evelyn was no longer the belle of the ball. She was a suspect under house arrest. Major Sterling had tripled the guards at the gates, and her father, Judge Harrison Vance, rarely looked her in the eye, his shame manifesting as a cold, brittle silence. However, the British arrogance was their undoing. Because she was a woman, and a fragile one at that, they continued to discuss the war in the rooms adjacent to her bedchamber. They assumed she was weeping over her embroidery when, in reality, her ear was pressed against the cold wainscoting, her mind recording every syllable of their malice. It was during a rainy Tuesday that the ledger appeared. Her father had left his study unlocked for a few minutes to greet a naval courier. Drawn by a magnetic pull of defiance, Evelyn slipped into the room. The air smelled of old parchment and the judge's expensive tobacco. On the desk sat a leather-bound book, its cover embossed with the king's initials. She opened it, expecting tax records or troop counts. Instead, she found a list of names, American generals, and beside each name, a price in British pounds and the name of a hired specialist. At the top of the list, written in her father's own sharp, legalistic hand, was the name, General George Washington. Beneath it was the plan, a coordinated ambush during a planned crossing of the Hudson. This wasn't war, it was murder. This was the ledger of lies. The choice of the blood. Evelyn stood frozen, the heavy ledger trembling in her hands. If she did nothing, the man who held the revolution together would be dead within 48 hours. The ink she and Sealers had fought for would be washed away by the blood of a leader. But if she tried to send this message, she would be signing her own death warrant. Major Sterling was already looking for a reason to send her to a prison ship in the harbor, the floating hells where men died of smallpox and starvation. "How much are you willing to blade, Evelyn?" she whispered to herself. She thought of Sealers. She thought of his ink-stained hands and the way he had looked at her in the fog, like she was the only thing worth fighting for in a world of madness. She realized that if she let this plot succeed, Sealers's sacrifice would be for nothing. He would be fighting for a cause that had already been decapitated. She took a small, sharp penknife from her father's desk. She didn't have time to copy the entire ledger. She needed to take the page. With a steady hand, she sliced the vellum along the binding. The sound of the paper tearing felt like the sound of her old life ending. The descent into the shadow. As she tucked the stolen page into her corset, the door handle turned. Evelyn barely had time to slide into the window seat and pick up a book before her father entered. He looked at her, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Evelyn, what are you doing in here?" "I was looking for something to read, Father. My own library has become stale." The judge walked to his desk. He looked at the ledger. For a terrifying second, Evelyn thought he would open it and notice the missing page. Her heart beat so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "Go to your room," he said, his voice a low growl. "Major Sterling is arriving for dinner. I expect you to be presentable, even if you are a disgrace." The dinner of daggers. The dinner that night was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Major Sterling sat across from Evelyn, his eyes never leaving her face. He spoke of the imminent end of the rebellion with a predatory glee. "We have a new strategy, Harrison," Sterling said, slicing into a bloody piece of roast beef. "A more surgical approach. We are no longer interested in winning battles. We are interested in removing the obstacles." Evelyn felt the stolen page scratching against her skin. It felt like a hot iron. She forced herself to eat, though every swallow felt like dry ash. "And what of the common soldiers, Major?" Evelyn asked, her voice surprisingly steady. "The printers and the farmers, do you plan to remove them as well?" Sterling smiled, a slow, terrifying expression. "Without their head, the body will thrash for a while and then die. And once Washington is gone, we will find every printer who ever dared to smudge the king's reputation and hang them with their own press rollers." Evelyn reached beneath the table, her fingers brushing the hilt of the small table knife she had surreptitiously slid into her lap. She wasn't going to be a victim. If they found the page tonight, she would not go quietly. The midnight run. When the house finally fell silent, Evelyn prepared for her escape. She knew the covenant of shadows was her only hope. She climbed out of her second-story window, using a trellis of ivy that tore at her hands. The New York streets were a gauntlet of patrols. She moved through the canvas town, the burnt-out ruins of the city where the poor and the displaced lived in tents. She reached the prearranged drop point, an old, hollowed-out oak tree near the ruins of Trinity Church. But the courier wasn't there. Instead, she saw the silhouette of a man in a scarlet coat. "Major Sterling." "I knew you couldn't resist, Evelyn," Sterling said, stepping out of the shadows. Two soldiers stepped behind her, blocking her retreat. "The ink always leads back to the source. Give me the page." "The cost of truth." Evelyn backed away, her heart hammering. "I don't know what you're talking about, Major." Sterling lunged forward, grabbing her by the arm. He searched her cloak, but found nothing. His eyes moved to her bodice. "You would hide treason against your own skin. How poetic." He reached for the page, but Evelyn pulled the small knife from her sleeve. She didn't aim for his heart. She aimed for the lantern he was holding. She struck the glass, and the oil erupted in a burst of flame between them. In the chaos and the smoke, Evelyn didn't run away. She ran through the fire. She felt the heat sear her arm. The blood was now her own, but she broke through the line of soldiers. She ran toward the docks, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She found the butcher's boy, the one who had helped her before. "Take this," she hissed, handing him the blood-stained, charred page from the ledger. "Get it to the camp at White Plains. Tell them Publia has sent the king's death warrant. Go." The cage of bone. The chapter ends with Evelyn being dragged back to the manor, her arm burned and her dress in tatters. She is no longer a guest in her father's house. She is a prisoner in a cellar room. Major Sterling stands over her, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and twisted admiration. "You've saved him for today, Evelyn, but you've sacrificed yourself. Was he worth it? Is the printer worth the gallows?" Evelyn looked up at him through the tangles of her hair. She felt the pain in her arm, but she also felt a strange, soaring sense of peace. The message was out. The ink had been delivered. "He's worth everything," she whispered. In the distance, across the river and through the woods, Silas Thorne sat by a fire, unaware that the woman he loved had just saved the world he was fighting for. He looked at his own scarred hands and felt a sudden, sharp pang in his chest, a sympathetic vibration of her pain. The ledger of lies was broken. The love story written in blood and ink had just become a legend of fire. The sound of the ambush. The intelligence Evelyn had stolen from the ledger of lies had saved the general, but it had turned the neutral ground into a hornet's nest. Silas Thorne and his small band of scouts were the rear guard, the sacrificial lambs meant to draw the British specialists away from the main continental retreat. The skirmish happened in a place the locals called the Devil's Throat, a narrow ravine flanked by jagged rocks and choked with autumn leaves. It wasn't a grand battle with lines and drums. It was a chaotic, wet nightmare of musketry and steel. Crack-thud, the sound of a lead ball hitting human bone, is a sound a man never forgets. Silas felt the impact before he felt the pain. It was a heavy, dull blow to his thigh that spun him around, sending his long rifle clattering into the mud. He hit the ground hard, the cold water of a shallow creek seeping into his clothes. Silas, Caleb, the boy he had saved at Valley Forge, screamed through the smoke. "Go," Silas roared, his voice cracking. He tried to stand, but his leg buckled, a white-hot spear of agony radiating from his hip to his toes. "That's an order, Caleb. Get to the ridge. Tell them the redcoats are flanking." He watched as his men retreated, their silhouettes disappearing into the grey fog. He was alone. The blood was flowing now, thick and dark, staining the clear water of the creek into a murky, crimson rust. The sanctuary of the stone. Silas dragged himself behind a large, lichen-covered boulder. Every inch of movement felt like he was being pulled through a fire. He looked at his wound. The ball had gone deep. He knew the anatomy of a soldier's death. This was the kind of wound that invited the cold sleep within hours. He leaned his back against the stone, gasping for air. The sounds of the skirmish were fading, moving deeper into the woods. The British would be back soon to clean the field. He reached into his haversack. He didn't look for bandages. He knew he didn't have enough cloth to stop this tide. Instead, he looked for his kit. A small, battered tin containing a stub of a pencil, a single crumpled sheet of parchment, and the silver locket. His hands, once the precise tools of a master printer, were shaking violently. They were covered in mud and his own blood. He looked at the parchment. This was the final ink. This was the last broadside of Sealer's Thorn. The final broadside. He began to write. He didn't have the strength for ciphers or codes. The time for shadows was over. "Evelyn," he wrote, the lead pencil tearing the damp paper. "The ink is stained today. I am writing this from the floor of a forest that doesn't know our names. My leg is broken and my breath is short, but my mind is at the well house in the fog." He paused, a wave of nausea rolling over him. He looked up at the canopy of trees. The sky was a pale, uncaring grey. He thought of the ledger of lies and the message Evelyn had sent. He knew she was in danger because of it. He felt a crushing weight of guilt. He had brought her into this war, turned a lady of silk into a woman of shadows. "Do not regret the ink, my love," he continued, his writing becoming jagged and large. "You saved the cause, you saved the general. If this is the price of a republic where we can be free, then I pay it gladly. But my heart is heavy because I will not be the one to lead you into that light." The shadow of the locket. A shadow fell over the ravine. Sealers froze, his hand moving instinctively toward the small hunting knife at his belt. But it was only a carrion crow, circling low in the mist. He pulled the silver locket from his neck. He opened it, looking at the empty space where a portrait should have been. To him, it wasn't empty. He saw her face, the amber eyes, the smudge of ink on her temple, the defiant set of her jaw. He pressed his thumb into the blood on his thigh and then pressed it onto the inside of the locket. A crimson seal. "I am leaving you this locket and this letter with a boy named Caleb," he wrote, though he didn't know if Caleb would ever find him. "Keep them not as a shroud, but as a map. Find the life we talked about. Find the quiet. Find a press that prints only poems." His vision began to tunnel. The edges of the world were turning black. The blood had taken too much. He felt cold, not the biting cold of Valley Forge, but a deep, internal winter that no fire could touch. The arrival of the specialist. A twig snapped. This time it wasn't a bird. A British officer, his uniform pristine despite the mud of the ravine, stepped into the clearing. It was Major Sterling. He had been hunting sealers since the night in the fog, driven by a personal vendetta that went beyond the war. "The printer," Sterling said, his voice echoing in the small canyon. He held his pistol leveled at Sealers's head. "I followed the trail of red. It seems your ink has finally run out." Sealers looked up, a bloody grin stretching across his pale face. He tucked the letter and the locket into the hollow of the stone behind him, shielding them with his body. "The ink never runs out, Sterling," Sealers rasped. "You can kill the printer, but you can't kill the word. The general lives. The message got through. You've already lost." Sterling's face contorted with rage. He cocked the hammer of the pistol. "Perhaps, but I shall have the satisfaction of ending the man who ruined the finest woman in New York." "She was never yours to ruin," Sealers whispered. The shot in the dark. Sterling pulled the trigger. But at that exact moment, a roar echoed from the ridge. Caleb and a dozen Continentals, who had refused to leave their sergeant behind, erupted from the tree line. Sterling's shot went wide, grazing Sealers's shoulder instead of his skull. The British officer was forced to dive for cover as a volley of American lead peppered the boulder. "Get him!" Caleb screamed, charging down the slope. In the chaos, Sterling retreated into the fog, vanishing like a ghost. Caleb reached Sealers, sliding into the mud beside him. Sealers, stay with us." Sealers looked at the boy. He reached out and grabbed Caleb's hand, pressing the blood-stained letter and the locket into his palm. For Evelyn, Sealers breathed, his eyes fluttering shut. The North End, the old well, find her. We'll get you to the surgeon, Sealers, just hold on. But Sealers didn't hear him. He had entered the ink-black night, the letter delivered, the blood spent, and the locket held tight in a boy's shaking hand. The echo of the letter. The chapter ends in the dark cell where Evelyn Vance is held. She sits against the wall, her burned arm wrapped in a dirty rag. Suddenly, she feels a cold shiver run down her spine. A sensation of a thread snapping in the dark. She looks at her hands, they are trembling. Sealers, she whispers to the stone walls. She doesn't know about the ravine, she doesn't know about the boulder or the specialist. But she feels the ink staining her soul, and she begins to weep, not for her own captivity, but for the man who just wrote his heart out on a piece of mud-soaked parchment. The blood had been spilled, now only the ink remained to tell the tale. The iron bars of Beacon Hill. The cellar of the Vance Manor had been transformed from a wine pantry into a makeshift dungeon. The air was damp, smelling of saltpeter and old rot. Evelyn Vance sat on a wooden stool, her bruised and burned arm throbbing in time with the dripping of water from the ceiling. She was no longer the golden girl. Her silk dress was torn at the hem, stained with the soot of the fire she had set to escape Major Sterling. But as she sat in the dark, she realized that her mind had never been sharper. The ink was not just on paper anymore, it was the way she thought, the way she calculated every move like a game of chess against the king himself. "You have 24 hours, Evelyn," her father's voice echoed from the top of the stairs. Judge Harrison Vance stood in the shaft of light, looking down at his daughter with a mixture of grief and pure, unadulterated shame. "Major Sterling has the warrant for your execution. The only thing keeping you from the gallows is my name, and that name is currently being dragged through the mud of your treason." "Then let it be dragged, father," Evelyn said, her voice raspy but cold. "At least the mud is honest. Your loyalty is just a mask for your fear." The interrogator's gambit. At midnight, the door creaked open. It wasn't her father, it was Major Sterling. He didn't come with guards. He came with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. He set them on the small table, the lantern light casting long, demonic shadows against the stone walls. "A final toast, Miss Vance?" Sterling asked, his voice smooth and terrifying, "to the spy in the silk dress. You played us all beautifully. Even I was charmed by your clumsy interest in the newspapers." Evelyn didn't move. "Why are you here, Sterling? If you have the warrant, use it." "I am here because I am a man of business," Sterling said, leaning in. "Your father is a judge. He has access to the secret correspondence of the Loyalist Council. You stole a page from the ledger, yes, but I want to know who your contact is. I want the printer. Tell me where Sealers Thorne is hiding, and I will see to it that you are merely exiled, not executed." Evelyn felt a surge of triumph. He doesn't know, she thought. He doesn't know that Sealers was in the ravine. He doesn't know if he's dead or alive. "Sealers Thorne is an idea, Major," she lied, her eyes locked onto his. "And you cannot execute an idea. The weapon of influence." Evelyn knew she couldn't outrun the British Army, but she could outmaneuver their politics. She spent the night preparing her ink. She knew her father had been keeping a secret ledger of his own, a list of British officers who had been taking bribes from American merchants to allow essential goods through the blockade. It was the ultimate hypocrisy. When the guards came to take her to the transport wagon at dawn, Evelyn asked for one final moment with her father. "Father," she whispered as the judge stood by the wagon, his face a mask of sorrow. "In the 3rd drawer of your desk, behind the false back, there is a blue ledger. If I die today, that ledger will be delivered to the Commander-in-Chief by a source you cannot stop. Every bribe you took, every officer you paid off, it will all come to light." The judge's face turned a sickly shade of grey. "You wouldn't, you are my daughter." "I am a patriot," Evelyn said, "and a patriot knows that sometimes the father must be sacrificed to save the cause." The escape in the mist. The leverage worked. Judge Vance, terrified of his own ruin, used his influence to divert the prisoner transport. Instead of the gallows at the common, the wagon was sent toward a secondary holding facility near the docks. But the spy in the silk dress had one more move. As the wagon rattled through the narrow, fog-filled streets near the East River, a group of wharf rats, undercover rebel sailors, attacked. It wasn't a skirmish, it was a surgical strike. The guards were overpowered in seconds. The door to the wagon swung open. "Miss Vance," a voice called out. It was Caleb, the boy from Silas's unit. He looked older, his face hardened by the war. "We have the boat ready, we have to go now." Evelyn stepped out of the wagon. The cool morning air felt like a benediction. She looked at Caleb, and then her eyes fell on the silver object hanging from his neck. "The locket, Silas's locket." "Where is he?" she gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Caleb looked down, his expression unreadable. He's at the camp in White Plains. He sent this for you, and a letter." "The letter from the dead or the living?" Evelyn climbed into the small skiff, the oars muffled with rags to silence their movement through the water. As they pulled away from the piers of New York, Caleb handed her the blood-stained parchment Silas had written in the ravine. Evelyn opened it. The sight of the crimson thumbprint and the jagged, desperate handwriting tore through her heart. She read the words, the ink stained by crimson, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry. "Is he alive, Caleb?" she asked, clutching the paper to her chest. "He was breathing when we left him with the surgeon," Caleb said softly. "But the blood was heavy. Miss, he told me to tell you that the ink never runs out." The transformation. As the skiff reached the Jersey shore, Evelyn looked back at the skyline of New York. She saw the British flags flying over the city, and she saw the mansion where she had spent her life as a lady. She reached down and tore a long strip of silk from her dress. She used it to tie her hair back, away from her face. She looked at her reflection in the dark river water. The silk dress was a ruin, but the woman inside was a steel blade. "I am no longer a spy," she whispered to the wind. "I am the rebellion." The road to White Plains. The chapter ends with Evelyn and Caleb riding a stolen horse toward the American lines. She wears a soldier's cloak over her ruined finery, the blood-stained letter tucked against her skin. She doesn't know what she will find at the end of the road. She doesn't know if Silas is a man or a memory, but she knows that the love story written in blood and ink is not over. It has moved beyond the ballroom and the print shop. It is now written in the very soil of the new world. "Faster," she told Caleb. "The ink is still wet. We have more to write." The long shadow of the Major. The road to White Plains was a ribbon of mud and fear. Evelyn Vance and Caleb had escaped the iron grip of New York, but they were being hunted. Behind them, the relentless hoofbeats of British dragoons echoed through the woods. Leading the chase was not a nameless soldier, but Major Julian Sterling, a man whose obsession with Evelyn had curdled into a cold, murderous need for order. However, among Sterling's elite unit was a man of a different caliber, Lieutenant Edward Harrington. Edward was a career soldier, a man who believed in the glory of the Empire until he saw the reality of the prison ships and the burning of civilian farms. For months, he had watched Sterling's descent into madness. He had seen the way the Major looked at Evelyn's stolen letters, not with the eyes of a lawman, but with the eyes of a man jealous of a ghost. As the unit set up a temporary camp near the Tarrytown woods, Edward was tasked with sorting through the belongings seized from the Vance Manor. There he found it, the Covenant of Shadows. He found the Book of Paradise Lost and the fragments of the ink that Silas and Evelyn had shared. The discovery of the soul. Edward sat by the campfire, the book open on his lap. Using a captured cipher key, he began to decode the messages for himself. He expected to find plans for troop movements and maps of powder houses. Instead, he found the cipher of the heart. "I am with you in every breath of frost," he read. "The pen shall be the map to our freedom." Edward felt a lump in his throat that no amount of military discipline could suppress. He looked at his own hands, clean, unlike Silas's thorn, but heavy with the weight of a war that felt increasingly hollow. He realized that these two people, a rebel rat and a traitorous lady, had found something more sacred than any crown or flag. They had found a truth that the Empire was trying to crush. "Lieutenant, why are you staring at the rebels' trash?" Sterling's voice cut through the night. The major stood at the edge of the firelight, his face gaunt, his eyes rimmed with red. "Just looking for names, Major," Edward lied, closing the book. "For the gallows." "Good, because when we catch them at the border, there will be no trial. The ink ends tomorrow." The collision at the crossroads. The next morning, the fog returned, the same spectral mist that had protected sealers in the orchard. Evelyn and Caleb were cornered at an old stone bridge. Their horse was lame, and the dragoons were closing in. Evelyn stood on the bridge, the blood-stained letter from sealers clutched in her hand. She looked at the dark water below. She would jump before she let Sterling take her back to the ledger of lies. "Yield, Evelyn," Sterling roared, emerging from the fog atop his black charger. He leveled his pistol. "The game is over. The printer is dead in a ditch, and you are mine to judge." "He is more alive than you will ever be, Julian," Evelyn shouted back, her voice ringing with a strength that stopped the soldiers in their tracks. Sterling cocked his pistol. The air was thick with the scent of wet stone and impending death, but before he could fire, a shot rang out from his own side. The choice of Lieutenant Harrington. Sterling's horse reared as a lead ball struck the ground inches from its hooves. The major spun around, his face a mask of shock. "What is the meaning of this, Harrington?" Edward Harrington stood with his musket leveled, not at the rebels, but at his commanding officer. His face was pale, but his eyes were the steadiest they had ever been. "The meaning is honor, Major," Edward said, his voice echoing through the ravine. "I have read their ink. I have seen their blood. There is more divinity in their treason than in your service. I will not let you murder a love that the king himself could not command." The dragoons hesitated. They were men of the crown, but they were also men. They looked at the girl on the bridge, a vision of silk turned to steel, and then at their trembling, vengeful major. "This is mutiny," Sterling screamed. "I will have you drawn and quartered." "Then let the history books record that a British officer chose to be a human being," Edward replied. He turned to Evelyn. "Go, Miss Vance. The American lines are 2 miles west. Run." "The deserters' sacrifice." Sterling lunged for his sword, but Edward stepped between him and the bridge. A chaotic skirmish broke out, not between rebel and redcoat, but between the old world and the new soul. Edward fought with a desperate, reckless grace. He wasn't fighting for Washington, he was fighting for sealers and Evelyn. He was fighting for the ink he had read by the campfire. "Go," Edward shouted over his shoulder as he parried a blow from a dragoon. Evelyn looked at the British lieutenant, the man who had been her enemy yesterday and was her savior today. She saw the covenant of shadows in his eyes. Without a word, she and Caleb turned and vanished into the thickest part of the woods. As she ran, she heard the sound of steel on steel and the final, frustrated roar of Major Sterling. She realized that the war had claimed a different kind of victim, a man of the crown who had deserted his post to save his soul. The arrival at the camp. 2 hours later, Evelyn and Caleb reached the American outposts at White Plains. They were exhausted, covered in mud, and shaking from the cold. A sentry stepped out, his bayonet leveled. "Who goes there?" "A friend of the printer," Evelyn gasped, showing the silver locket. They were ushered through the camp, a sprawling city of tents and campfires that smelled of wood smoke and hope. Evelyn's heart was in her throat. Every soldier she saw looked like sealers, and yet none of them were. They reached a large, white medical tent. The air inside was thick with the smell of vinegar and blood. "I am looking for Sergeant Thorne," she told a harried-looking surgeon. The surgeon pointed to a cot in the far corner, shielded by a tattered linen sheet. "He's been asking for a woman named Publia for 3 days. Miss, we didn't think he'd make the night." The ink's final chapter. Evelyn walked to the cot. Her legs felt like lead. She pulled back the sheet. Sealers lay there, his face pale, his chest heavily bandaged. His hands, the hands that had pulled the press and fired the rifle, were resting still on the wool blanket. He looked like a statue of the man she loved. She sat beside him and took his hand. It was cold, but as she touched him, his fingers twitched. "Silas," she whispered. His eyes fluttered open. For a moment they were glassy and distant, lost in the winter of frozen hopes. Then he saw her. He saw the silk turn to cloth, the lady turn to rebel. "Evelyn," he breathed, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. The advertisement, did the horses get claimed?" "They're home, Silas," she sobbed, pressing his hand to her cheek. "The ink is dry and the horses are home." In the distance, Edward Harrington, now a deserter of the Crown, was being led away in chains by Sterling's men, but he was smiling. He had seen them reach the ridge. He had ensured that the love story written in blood and ink would have a final page. The chapter ends with the two of them in the dim light of the hospital tent. The war was far from over, but the covenant had held. The ink had survived the blood, and the silk had found its thorn. The Southern Furnace. By 1780, the center of gravity of the war had shifted from the frozen woods of the north to the humid, mosquito-choked swamps of the Carolinas. For Silas Thorne, now a lieutenant, the change in climate was a mirror of his internal decay. The crisp, ideological clarity of the Boston ink had been replaced by the heavy, suffocating blood of a war that seemed to have no end. He stood on the edge of a pine barren near Camden, South Carolina. The heat was a physical weight, pressing the breath out of his lungs. His uniform was a tattered collection of rags, and the silver locket around his neck had begun to tarnish from the constant salt of his sweat. The psychological toll was visible in his eyes. They were thousand-yard stares, looking through the trees as if searching for a world that no longer existed. He had seen the siege of Charleston, the brutal butchery of Waxhaws, and the betrayal of neighbors turning against neighbors in a civil war more savage than any battle with the British. "We aren't fighting for a republic anymore, Caleb," Silas whispered one night, watching the fireflies dance over a stagnant pool of water. "We're just fighting to see the next sunrise." The prison of the spirit. 600 miles to the north, Evelyn Vance was enduring a different kind of siege. After the deserter of the Crown incident, she had been moved to a high-security loyalist compound in Virginia. She was no longer a socialite. She was a political prisoner, kept as leverage against her father's crumbling reputation. The isolation was her greatest enemy. For months, the covenant of shadows had been broken. No letters reached her. No news of Silas's survival or death filtered through the stone walls of her room. She lived in a vacuum of silence, where her only companions were the memories of ink-stained hands and the smell of a print shop in autumn. The Siege of Hearts was the internal battle against despair. Evelyn began to draw on the walls with pieces of charcoal, not maps or ciphers, but the words of Silas's letters. She filled the stone surfaces with his promises, turning her cell into a sanctuary of the ink. "The ink is still wet," she wrote over the fireplace. "The pen is the map." The erosion of identity. As the Southern campaign intensified, Silas found himself losing the printer and becoming entirely the soldier. He had to make decisions that haunted his sleep, ordering the hanging of loyalists who had burned rebel homes or requisitioning food from starving families to feed his men. He felt the blood staining his soul. One afternoon, after a skirmish near a tobacco barn, he looked at his hands. They were covered in the dark soil of the South and the copper-scented blood of an enemy. He tried to remember the sensation of picking up a lead letter, A or E, but the memory felt thin and ghostly. "I am losing the man she loved," Silas wrote in a journal he knew might never reach her. "If I survive this, Evelyn, will you recognize the beast I have become to keep us free?" The ghostly communication. In late 1780, a miracle occurred. A rebel scout, captured and then released in a prisoner exchange, brought a message to Evelyn's location. It wasn't a letter, it was a song. The scout sat in the courtyard, singing a popular tavern ballad about a printer and a lady. The lyrics were nonsensical to the guards, but to Evelyn, they were a cipher. The melody followed the rhythm of their old, Paradise Lost code. Page 50, line 3, word 10. The word was marching. Page 62, line 1, word 4. The word was yorktown. Evelyn stood at her window, her fingers clutching the iron bars. The ink was still flowing. Sealers was in the south, and the war was converging on a small port town in Virginia. The Siege of Hearts had a destination. The breaking point. The psychological toll reached its zenith during the Siege of Yorktown. Sealers was in the trenches, digging through the red clay under the constant bombardment of British cannons. The sound was a rhythmic, soul-crushing thunder that made his teeth ache. He was exhausted, malnourished, and hallucinating. In the smoke of the mortar shells, he saw Evelyn's face. He saw her in the traitor's ballroom. He saw her in the fog. He realized that if he didn't reach her soon, there would be nothing left of him to give. "One last push," Sealers told Caleb, who was now a grown man, his face scarred by a bayonet. "If we take the redoubt, the war ends, and if the war ends, the silence ends." The fall of the walls. The chapter climaxes with the surrender of Cornwallis. As the British regulars marched out to the tune of the world turned upside down, Sealers didn't feel triumph. He felt a profound, hollow exhaustion. He walked through the lines of defeated redcoats, his eyes searching every carriage and every group of loyalist refugees. He found her near the docks. She was standing among a group of women being processed for transport. She was wearing a simple, faded dress, her hair streaked with premature gray at the temples. She looked like a ghost of the girl from Beacon Hill. Sealers stopped 10 paces away. He was covered in the red dust of Virginia, his beard long and matted, his uniform a disgrace to any army. "Evelyn," he whispered. She turned. For a moment she didn't see him. She saw a soldier, one of thousands. Then her gaze locked onto the silver locket hanging outside his tunic. The Union of Scars. The Siege of Hearts ended not with a shout, but with a silent, trembling embrace. They held each other as the world around them celebrated the birth of a nation. They didn't speak of liberty or kings. They spoke of the ink that had survived the blood. "You came," she breathed into his dusty shoulder. "The ink never ran out," he replied. The chapter concludes with them sitting on the banks of the York River. The war was over, but the scars were deep. They were two broken people who had spent their youth and their sanity to buy a future they weren't sure how to live in. But as Sealers pulled a small, dried-up inkwell from his bag and set it on a rock between them, Evelyn smiled. She took a quill from her hair and dipped it into the dry crust at the bottom. "Let's write the ending," she said. The Siege of Hearts was over. The Republic of the Soul was beginning. The return to the roots. Boston in 1783 was a city of echoes. The British were gone, the blockades were lifted, and the smell of the sea was no longer choked by the scent of gunpowder. But for Sealers Thorne and Evelyn Vance, the city felt like a cathedral built on a graveyard. They walked toward the north end, their hands entwined. Sealers's limp was pronounced, a permanent gift from the devil's throat, and Evelyn's arm still bore the faint, silvery puckers of her burns from New York. They were young in years, but their eyes held the weight of centuries. They stopped at the great elm, the Liberty Tree. Once a site of boisterous protests and hanging effigies, it now stood silent in the amber light of a late autumn afternoon. To the world, it was a symbol of triumph. To Sealers and Evelyn, it was a monument to the blood that had paid for the ink. "It's just a tree now," Sealers whispered, his fingers brushing the rough bark. "The ghosts have gone home." "No," Evelyn replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "The ghosts are in the roots, Sealers. We are the ones standing in the shadow they left behind." The ledger of the lost. They sat beneath the sprawling branches, and Sealers pulled a small, worn notebook from his coat. It wasn't a ledger of lies or a book of codes. It was a list of names. He began to read them aloud, his voice thick with the memory of the southern furnace and the winter of frozen hopes. Jonas, the cooper from Lexington; Caleb, who died of a fever 3 days after the surrender; Edward Harrington, the lieutenant who deserted his crown to save our souls, executed at dawn in a loyalist camp. Each name was a drop of ink on the soul of the new nation. They reflected on the cost. For every pamphlet Evelyn had written as Publia, a man had died in a trench. For every secret Sealers had carried as a courier, a home had been burned. Was it worth the blood, Sealers? Evelyn asked, looking at the city skyline. We have our republic, we have our names back, but the silence in the streets, it feels like a heavy debt. Sealers looked at his hands that had mastered the press, then the rifle, and now trembled with the weight of the peace. The cost was too high, Evelyn, it always is, but the alternative was a life where our children would have been born into silence. We didn't fight to win, we fought so they wouldn't have to. The final piece of silk. Evelyn reached into her pocket and pulled out a small scrap of crimson silk, the last remnant of the dress that had been her armor in the traitor's ballroom and Sealers's bandage in Valley Forge. It was frayed, stained with oil and old blood, but it still held a faint shimmer. She tied the silk to a low-hanging branch of the Liberty Tree. It fluttered in the breeze like a small, defiant flame. This is for the woman I was, she said, the girl who thought the war was a poem. Sealers took his silver locket, the one that had caught the British bullet and held the crimson thumbprint, and buried it deep within the soil at the base of the tree. And this is for the printer, Sealers said, the man who thought the word was enough. The architecture of peace. They talked about the future, though the word felt strange in their mouths. Sealers had regained possession of the old print shop on Queen Street. The great press was still there, rusted and silent, waiting for a new voice. I won't print broadsides about war anymore, Sealers told her. I want to print the things that make life worth living. I want to print the laws that protect the weak and the stories that make people laugh. And I will write them, Evelyn said, but not as Publia. I want to write as Evelyn Thorne. I want the world to know that the ink belongs to us now, not to the cause. The psychological toll was still there. The way Sealers jumped at the sound of a carriage wheel hitting a stone, the way Evelyn searched every face for Major Sterling's ghost. But beneath the Liberty Tree, they realized that peace was not the absence of war. It was the slow, difficult process of rebuilding the heart. The union of scars and stars. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the common, they stood up. The city was beginning to light its lamps, not for a victory gala, but for the simple, mundane business of coming home. They looked at each other, seeing the scars, the grey hair, and the hard-won wisdom. They were a map of the revolution. We are the ink, and the world is the paper, Sealers said, pulling her close. Then let us write something beautiful, she replied. The chapter concludes with the two of them walking away from the Liberty Tree, leaving their ghosts behind. The love story written in blood and ink had reached its final sentence. The blood had been shed, the ink had been spent, and what remained was the quiet, enduring light of a new day. The epilogue of the soul. The story ends not with a grand speech or a parade, but with the sound of a printing press. Back in the shop, Sealers and Evelyn stood before the machine. Sealers handed her a fresh sheet of paper. She dipped her pen, not into the ledger of lies, but into a bottle of clear, blue ink. She wrote a single word at the top of the page, freedom. And Sealers, with the strength of a soldier and the precision of a printer, pulled the lever. The ink met the paper, the blood was honored, and for the first time in 8 years, the silence was filled with the sound of a promise kept. The Siege of the Senses. October 1781. The air in Yorktown, Virginia, did not smell of the sea. It smelled of sulfur, charred timber, and the iron-sweet scent of the dying. The British, led by Lord Cornwallis, were trapped with their backs to the York River, while the combined American and French forces tightened the noose. Sealers Thorne stood in the parallel trenches, his boots sinking into the red Virginian clay. For 21 days the earth had trembled. The ink of the Declaration had led them here, but it was the blood of the trenches that would finish it. Sealers looked at his hands. The tremors he had developed at Valley Forge were gone, replaced by a cold, unnatural stillness. He was no longer a printer. He was a weapon of the Continental Army, honed by years of retreat and loss. Across the lines, the British fortifications, redoubts 9 and 10, loomed like black teeth against the bruised twilight sky. These were the final obstacles. If they fell, the world would turn upside down. The empty seat in New York. Hundreds of miles away, in the occupied silence of the Vance Manor, Evelyn felt the echo of the cannons in her very marrow. She sat at her father's desk, the same desk where she had stolen the ledger of lies. The house was empty. Her father had fled to a British frigate in the harbor, but Evelyn had refused to go. She sat in the dark, a single candle burning low. She was writing, but there was no one to send the letters to. She was writing to the ghost of Sealers, filling pages with the mundane details of a life she hoped they would one day share. "The wind is from the south tonight, Sealers," she whispered, her quills scratching frantically. "It tastes of smoke. Are you there? Are you still writing our story with your life?" She reached for her silver locket, but it wasn't there. She had sent it with Caleb months ago. She felt untethered, a spy without a mission, a lover without a heartbeat to echo her own. The final charge. On the night of October 14, the order came. "Fix bayonets." Alexander Hamilton's voice rang out through the trenches. Sealers stepped onto the scaling ladder. The plan was suicide, a night assault with unloaded muskets. They were to rely on cold steel alone. The ink was to be silent, only the blood would speak tonight. The signal, 3 shells fired in rapid succession, lit up the sky. Sealers surged over the parapet. The world became a kaleidoscope of flashes and screams. He ran through the abatis, the sharpened logs designed to impale chargers. He felt the wood tear at his coat, but he didn't stop. "For the North End," he roared, though his voice was lost in the thunder of the French cannons. He reached the top of Redoubt 10. A British soldier lunged at him with a bayonet. Sealers parried, the metal clashing with a sound like a bell. He moved with a brutal, mechanical efficiency, his mind a blank slate. He wasn't thinking of liberty, he was thinking of the way Evelyn's hair looked in the candlelight. Every thrust of his blade was a desperate attempt to clear the path back to her. Lost in the smoke. In the heart of the redoubt, the chaos reached a fever pitch. A powder keg exploded nearby, throwing Sealers backward. He hit the ground, his ears ringing, his vision blurred by a thick, yellow fog of gunpowder smoke. He tried to stand, but a shadow loomed over him. It was a British officer, Major Sterling. The specialist had survived the ravine, survived the fog, and had been waiting for this final meeting in the mud of Virginia. "The printer," Sterling hissed, his face a mask of soot and blood. He raised his sword. "The world may turn upside down tonight, Thorne, but you won't be there to see it." Sealers scrambled for his fallen knife. The 2 men rolled in the dirt, a microcosm of the entire war, the obsessed officer of the crown and the ink-stained soldier of the Republic. They were locked in a siege of hearts that could only end in the grave. Sterling's blade found Sealers's side. Sealers felt the cold bite of the steel, a twin to the wound he had suffered on the Hudson. But he didn't falter. He grabbed Sterling's collar, pulling him close. "The ink is permanent," Sealers gasped, driving his knife home. Sterling fell back, his eyes wide with a final, shocked realization. He slumped into the mud, another name for the ledger of the dead. Sealers tried to crawl away, but the world was spinning. The echo of Yorktown was fading into a dull, grey hum. He collapsed against the wooden wall of the redoubt as the American flag was raised above him. The world turned upside down. October 19, 1781. The surrender ceremony was a silent affair. The British Army marched out between the lines of victorious Americans and Frenchmen. The music was solemn, the rhythm of a dying empire. Caleb searched the ranks of the Maryland line. He searched the field hospitals. He searched the piles of the dead. "Sealers," he called out, his voice breaking. "Lieutenant Thorne." He found only a tattered blue coat near the edge of Redoubt 10. Tucked into the pocket was a small, scorched piece of vellum, the last letter Evelyn had sent. It was soaked in blood, the words, "I am with you," barely legible through the crimson stain. In New York, Evelyn stood on the battery, watching the horizon. A courier on horseback approached, his mount lathered in foam. He didn't have a letter. He had a message, whispered from mouth to mouth across the colonies. "Yorktown has fallen," the messenger shouted. "The war is over." Evelyn didn't cheer. She looked at the blood-red sun setting over the water. She felt the thread, the covenant of shadows, pull tight and then go slack. The echo in the silence. The chapter ends not with a victory parade, but with the haunting image of the battlefield at night. The cannons are silent. The blood has stopped flowing. The ink of the surrender documents is drying on the table in the Moore house. Silas Thorne is missing. To the army, he is a statistic, a hero lost in the final charge. To the world, he is a ghost. But as the moon rises over the York River, a small, blackened hand moves in the shadows of the redoubt. A silver locket, discarded in the dirt, catches a stray beam of light. The echo of the war is loud, but the silence of the heart is louder. The world has turned upside down, and in the ruins of the old world, the search for the survivors begins. The Ghost of Queen Street. Boston, 1783. The formal peace had been signed in Paris, the ink of treaties finally drying on the parchment of history. But in the North End, the silence was louder than the cannons of Yorktown. Evelyn Vance stood before the door of the Thorne printing shop. The wooden sign, once proud and painted with a golden quill, now hung by a single rusted hinge, creaking in the salt-heavy wind of the harbor. The windows were opaque with years of dust and sea spray, acting as a veil between the world of the living and the world of the midnight courier. She turned the key, a heavy iron weight she had carried through the prisons of Virginia and the ballrooms of New York. The lock groaned, a metallic protest against the intrusion of time. As the door swung open, the smell hit her, old paper, dried linseed oil, and the cold, metallic ghost of lead type. It was the smell of her beginning. She feared it was also the smell of her end. The machinery of memory. Evelyn walked through the shop, her fingers trailing over the skeletal frames of the composing sticks. In the center of the room sat the great press, its heavy iron arm raised like a limb frozen in mid-stride. There was no ink here. The wells were dry, the leather ink balls cracked and shriveled like old fruit. The silence of the press was absolute. It was a silence that spoke of every word Silas had ever whispered to her, every coded advertisement that had saved a life, and every letter that had gone unanswered since the smoke cleared at Redoubt 10. She sat on a stool, her velvet cloak pooling around her on the floor. She had returned to the ruins of her old life, but she was no longer a lady. Her father was an exile in London. Her inheritance was a heap of legal ash. She was a woman of the Republic, but the Republic felt like a vast, empty room. The vigil of the docks. Every morning for 3 months, Evelyn went to the Long Wharf. She watched the ships come in, not the warships of the king, but the merchant brigs and the troop transports bringing home the remnants of the Continental Army. She searched every face. She looked for the printer's brow, the way Silas used to furrow his forehead when he was thinking of a difficult layout. She looked for the soldier's limp. She looked for the silver locket she had sent into the fire of the South. "Have you seen him?" she would ask the sunburnt men who stepped off the gangplanks. "Lieutenant Silas Thorne, the Maryland line, the North End printer." The answers were always the same. A shake of the head, a downward glance, or a sympathetic, "Many stayed in the red clay of Virginia, miss." The silence was becoming a physical weight. It was the silence of a grave. She began to wonder if her life had become a ledger of lies. She told herself, the lie that a man could survive a bayonet in the side and the collapse of a world. The ink of the heart. To keep from going mad, Evelyn began to work. She cleaned the shop. She scrubbed the floors until the wood shone. She oiled the great press until the arm moved without a sound. She didn't have paper, so she used the backs of old Loyalist broadsides. She didn't have fresh ink, so she scraped the dried crusts from the bottom of the vats and mixed them with lamp oil. She began to print. She didn't print news. She printed a single name over and over again until the shop was filled with thousands of scraps of paper. Silas, Silas, Silas. The ink was thin and gray, but it was a bridge. It was her way of shouting into the silence. She pinned the names to the door of the shop. She left them on the benches of the common. She dropped them into the harbor to be carried out to sea. "If the word is a map," she whispered to the press, "then come home, find the ink." The man in the fog. The winter of 1783 brought a fog so thick it reminded her of the night at the Well House. Evelyn was closing the shop, her hands stained with the grey, salvaged ink. She felt a sudden, sharp chill, not the cold of the wind, but the covenant of shadows pulling tight once more. A shadow appeared across the street near the Liberty Tree. It was a man, leaning heavily on a crutch made of rough-hewn oak. He was dressed in a coat that had no color left, a rag of blue and brown. He didn't move. He stood looking at the door of the shop, where 1,000 slips of paper fluttered in the breeze. Evelyn stepped onto the cobblestones. Her heart was beating so hard she thought it would shatter the ribs that had survived the Major's grip. "Sailors," she breathed. The man turned. Half of his face was a map of scars. The blood of Yorktown had left its mark. His eyes were hollow, the eyes of a man who had walked through the valley of the shadow, but around his neck, hanging by a piece of twine, was a silver locket. The resurrection of the word. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His voice had been stolen by the smoke and the screams of the redoubt. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, one of the slips she had dropped into the street. On the back, he had written a single word with a piece of charcoal: "Always." Evelyn didn't fly to him like a heroine in a poem. She walked slowly, her boots clicking on the damp stones. She reached out and touched the scars on his face, tracing the path where the blood had flowed. She touched the silver locket. They stood in the silence of the North End, a silence that was no longer empty but full. The printing press was still, the war was over, and the ink had finally found its paper. "The shop is ready, Sealers," she whispered, her tears washing the ink from his hands. "The press is oiled. We have a new world to write." VII, the first page. The chapter ends with the two of them entering the shop together. Sealers sat at the composing stone, his hands shaking, scarred, but alive, reaching for the lead type. He didn't look for the words war or victory or king. He picked out the letters, one by one, and set them in the frame. He looked at Evelyn and nodded. She pulled the lever of the great press. The silence was broken by the rhythmic, heartbeat thump of the machine. They pulled the first page of their new life. It didn't have a headline. It didn't have a code. It had only their names, intertwined in the center of the white space, written in a deep, permanent black. The love story written in blood and ink was finished. The story of the piece had just begun. The stranger in the sunlight. The man sitting in the corner of the Thorn printing shop was a ghost dressed in skin. Sealers Thorn had been back in Boston for a month, but his soul seemed trapped in the red clay of Virginia. The morning light that streamed through the clean windows of the shop was too bright for him. It illuminated the jagged scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, the final echo of Major Sterling's blade. Evelyn watched him from the composing table. She had spent years dreaming of this return, but the man who sat there was not the idealistic apprentice she had fallen in love with, nor was he the defiant midnight courier. He was a man who flinched at the sound of a falling book as if it were a musket shot. "The ink is fresh today, Sealers," she said softly, her voice a gentle tether. "I've mixed it with the walnut oil you like. It has that deep, velvet sheen." Sealers didn't look up. He was staring at his hands. They were calloused and mapped with the white lines of old burns and bayonet grazes. To Sealers, these hands were no longer meant for creation. They were instruments of blood. "I can still smell it, Evelyn," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Every time I look at the black ink, I see the smoke of the redoubt. Every time I touch the paper, I feel the dry parchment of a dying man's letter. How can we print a future when the past is stained so deep?" The psychological seed. The scars of independence were not just on his skin. Sealers suffered from a silence that Evelyn couldn't penetrate. At night, he would wake up screaming, his hands clutching at his side where the bayonet had pierced him. He would pace the small apartment above the shop like a caged animal, searching for a sentinel that wasn't there. He questioned the very foundation of their devotion. "You loved a man who believed in words, Evelyn," he told her one night, sitting in the dark. "But that man died at Lexington, or maybe he died at Valley Forge. I have killed men in the dark. I have seen the blood erase the ink until there was nothing left but the screaming. Can a woman of your station truly love a butcher?" Evelyn walked to him, but she didn't touch him. She had learned that sudden touch startled him. "I didn't love a man of words, Sealers. I loved a man of conviction. The station you think I hold died in the cellar of my father's house. We are both butchers of our old lives. We have to make room for the new one." The ghost of Sterling. The psychological toll was worsened by the lingering shadow of the war. Even though the British had surrendered, the loyalists who remained in Boston whispered in the taverns. They looked at Sealers's scars and saw a traitor. They looked at Evelyn and saw a fallen lady. One afternoon, a former business associate of Judge Vance entered the shop. He looked at Sealers with a sneer. "So, the printer returns to find his silk in the mud. Tell me, Thorne, was the Republic worth your face? You look more like a gargoyle than a husband." Sealers's hand went instinctively to the heavy iron lever of the press. For a moment, the soldier returned to his eyes, a cold, lethal light that made the visitor stumble backward. "Sealers, no!" Evelyn stepped between them. The man fled, but the damage was done. Sealers sank onto a crate, his chest heaving. "You see, the blood is still there. It's waiting to come out. I am a danger to you, Evelyn." The mending of the ink. Evelyn realized that Sealers wouldn't heal by resting, he would heal by working. She began to force the ink back into his life. She didn't ask him to print grand proclamations. She asked him to print a poem, a simple 4-line verse she had written about a garden in autumn. At first, Sealers's hands shook so badly he dropped the lead letters. He cursed, the language of the trenches spilling out of him, but Evelyn didn't flinch. She picked up the letter A and handed it back to him. "Again," she said. Slowly, the rhythm of the shop began to work its magic. The tactile sensation of the cold metal type, the repetitive motion of the lever, it was a form of prayer. Sealers began to find his focus. The silence of the printing press was replaced by the mechanical heartbeat of the great press. As the ink began to flow, Sealers started to talk. He told her about the things he hadn't written in his letters, the loneliness of the scouting missions, the face of the first man he had killed, and the way the silver locket had felt like a hot coal against his chest during the charge at Yorktown. The Union of Scars. The climax of the chapter occurs on a rainy evening. Sealers was sitting by the fire, his shirt open, the scars on his torso visible in the orange light. Evelyn sat beside him, and for the first time, she traced the scars with her fingers. "This one is from the Hudson," she whispered, touching the ridge of flesh on his shoulder. "And this one is from the redoubt." Sealers flinched, but he didn't pull away. "They are ugly, Evelyn. They are reminders of everything we lost." "No," she said, leaning in to kiss the scar on his jaw. "They are the ink of our history, Sealers. Without them, the page is blank. They don't mean we are broken. They mean we were strong enough to survive the breaking." In that moment, the blood finally stopped being a ghost. Sealers looked at her, and for the first time since he had returned, the 1,000-yard stare was gone. He saw her, not as a symbol of his lost innocence, but as the partner of his scarred reality. The first edition. The chapter ends with them standing together at the press. They were no longer the courier and the lady. They were the owners of the Thorne and Vance Gazette. They weren't printing a ledger of lies or a covenant of shadows. They were printing the first edition of a newspaper dedicated to the people of the North End. Sealers pulled the lever. The sound was no longer a musket crack to his ears. It was the sound of a voice returning. He pulled the sheet of paper and looked at it. The ink was black, bold, and beautiful. "The ink is still wet," he said, a genuine smile finally breaking through the scarred lines of his face. "It always will be," Evelyn replied. The scars of independence remained, but they were no longer a barrier. They were the binding of their story, a story written in blood, preserved in ink, and finally lived in peace. The dust of the attic. It was the summer of 1785, 2 years after the final echoes of Yorktown had faded. The Vance mansion in New York, once a bastion of loyalist power, was being cleared out by the new government to be converted into a public office. Evelyn Thorne, having returned to the city of her captivity for the final settling of her father's estate, stood in the sweltering heat of the attic. The air was thick with the scent of cedar, old wool, and the slow decay of abandoned dreams. Sealers was with her, his limp heavy on the floorboards as he moved through the crates of confiscated property. "Your father left a ghost in every corner of this house," Evelyn, Sealers remarked, his hand resting on the hilt of his walking stick. "He left a legacy of ash, Sealers. I just want to find the family Bibles and be gone." But as they moved a heavy mahogany chest, they found a loose floorboard beneath the eaves. Tucked into the hollow was not a Bible, but a small, iron-bound lockbox. It bore the seal of the British Secret Service, but beneath it, in a frantic, dying hand, was written, "The last will and testament of a broken empire." The Ledger of Truths. They took the box back to their rooms at the tavern. Sealers used a printer's tool to jemmy the lock. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, the personal diary of Major Julian Sterling, the specialist who had hunted them across the colonies. As Evelyn turned the pages, her breath hitched. This wasn't a diary of military tactics, it was a record of obsession. Sterling had kept meticulous notes on every advertisement Evelyn had placed, every scrap of ink she had sent, and every movement Sealers had made. But the revelation came halfway through the book. Sterling had written a confession he never intended for his superiors to see. September 1777, the fleet moves toward the Chesapeake. I suspected the Vance girl of treachery, but I could not prove the code. Her horse-trading notices alerted Washington. The ink reached him 3 days before our arrival. We found the rebels prepared. The failure at Brandywine was not a failure of arms. It was a failure to silence the woman in the silk dress. The catalyst of victory. Sealers leaned over her shoulder, his scarred face illuminated by the candlelight. They read on, their hearts hammering in unison. Sterling's journal detailed how the Covenant of Shadows had been the silent architect of multiple victories. The ink had warned of the Hessian reinforcements at Trenton. The blood Sealers had spilled at the Hudson had delayed a flanking maneuver that would have destroyed the Maryland line. And the ledger of lies Evelyn had stolen in New York had directly prevented the assassination of General Washington. "We weren't just writing to each other, Sealers," Evelyn whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "We were writing the map of the war. We thought we were just trying to survive, but every word we sent was a bayonet in the heart of the crown." The journal proved that their love, the very thing they thought was a distraction from the war, was actually the catalyst for its success. The ink was more powerful than the cannons because it was fueled by a devotion that the British military machine could not comprehend. The shadow of the specialist. The final pages of the journal were the most chilling. Sterling had documented his realization that he couldn't win. October 1781, the printer survives. "He is a ghost that haunts the redoubts. I see now that I am not fighting an army, I am fighting a story, and a story written in such blood cannot be erased. If I fall, let it be known that the American Republic was born in a print shop and nurtured in a lady's parlor." Sealers closed the book, his hands trembling. For years, he had carried the scars of independence as a burden of shame and trauma. He had questioned if the blood was worth it. Now, in the dead man's own words, he had his answer. "He knew," Sealers said, his voice a low rasp. "Even our enemy knew that what we had was the only thing they couldn't break." The choice of legacy. Evelyn looked at the journal. "We could give this to the Congress, Sealers. We could be hailed as heroes. You could have your pick of any office in the new government." Sealers looked at the great press in his mind, and then at the scars on Evelyn's arm. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the wedding ring they had finally managed to buy. "Is that the story you want to tell, Evelyn, that we were agents and spies?" Evelyn looked at the fireplace. She thought of the silence of the printing press and the union of scars. She realized that their last will and testament wasn't a public record, it was the life they were living now. "No," she said, "the world has enough heroes in bronze. I'd rather be a printer's wife in the North End." The final sacrifice of the ink. They didn't take the journal to the newspapers. They didn't take it to the general. Instead, they walked to the banks of the Hudson River. The water was dark, reflecting the stars of the new American sky. Sealers held the journal, the last will and testament of their greatest enemy and their greatest secret. "For the ghosts," Sealers said. "For the ink," Evelyn added. Sealers tossed the book into the river. It splashed once and was swallowed by the current, carrying Sterling's obsession and their secret history out to the Atlantic. The covenant of shadows would remain in the shadows where it belonged. They didn't need the world to know they had saved the revolution. They only needed to know that they had saved each other. The morning after. The chapter ends with them walking back to the tavern, the weight of the war finally, truly lifted. They were no longer the courier and the spy. They were simply Sealers and Evelyn. The last will and testament was gone, but the Republic of the Soul was intact. As they boarded the coach back to Boston, Sealers pulled a fresh piece of parchment from his bag and a small bottle of ink. He didn't write a code. He didn't write a report. He wrote a poem, the first one he had ever written that wasn't a disguise. "The war is but a ghost of ink. The blood is but a memory's stain. We found the path upon the brink and turned the loss to love's refrain." Evelyn smiled as she read the words. The ink was no longer a weapon. It was finally, beautifully, just a poem. This final chapter brings the saga of Sealers and Evelyn to its ultimate resolution. To meet the depth of your request, this narrative serves as a sprawling 4,000-word immersion into the transition from the blood of the coast to the peace of the frontier. The departure from the coast. Boston had become a city of ghosts for Sealers and Evelyn Thorne. Every cobblestone on Queen Street whispered of secret meetings. Every gust of wind from the harbor smelled of the tea and gunpowder of '73. While they had rebuilt the printing shop, they realized that they were living in a museum of their own trauma. In the spring of 1787, Sealers packed the small, portable Chapman press into the back of a sturdy wagon. He was no longer the limping ghost of Yorktown. The mountain air of his dreams had already begun to heal his lungs. Evelyn stood beside him, trading her silk gowns for durable homespun linen. "The Republic is born, Sealers," she said, looking back at the spire of the Old North Church one last time. "But it is crowded. I want to go where the ink has never touched the paper." They were headed west, toward the Ohio River Valley, the new frontier of the young nation. They weren't fleeing the war, they were carrying the promise of the war to the wilderness. The journey through the Green Cathedral. The journey was a month-long meditation on the scale of their sacrifice. As they crossed the Appalachian Mountains, Sealers felt the weight of the blood lifting. Out here, there were no British regulars, no specialists, and no ledgers of lies. There was only the infinite, cathedral-like silence of the ancient forests. They traveled with a small caravan of veterans, men Sealers had served with at Valley Forge. They shared stories around the evening fires, but the stories had changed. They no longer spoke of the first volley at Lexington with terror. They spoke of it as the labor pains of the land they were now traversing. Evelyn became the chronicler of the journey. She didn't write in code. She sat by the fire each night and wrote about the way the light hit the dogwood trees and the taste of wild berries. "The ink is finally mine, Sealers," she told him. "It doesn't belong to the cause anymore. It belongs to the beauty of the day." The Valley of the Long Shadow. They found their forever home in a valley nestled between two rolling hills, where a clear spring fed into a wide, slow-moving river. Sealers stood on the land, leaning on his plow instead of his rifle. "This is it," he whispered. "This is the quiet we talked about in the letters." Building the home was the final battle. It was a war against the elements, a struggle of muscle and wood. Silas's scarred hands grew calloused from the axe, but for the first time, the pain was constructive. He wasn't digging trenches, he was laying foundations. He built a small, separate cabin for the press. It was the first printing house in the territory. While other settlers brought only seeds and livestock, Silas had brought the word. The first Frontier Gazette. On a crisp October morning, 10 years to the day after the world turned upside down at Yorktown, Silas and Evelyn stood in their cabin. The smell of fresh pine sap mixed with the familiar, pungent scent of printer's ink. They weren't printing a call to arms. They were printing the first edition of the Wilderness Advocate. "What shall be the lead story?" Silas asked, his hand resting on the lever of the press. Evelyn looked out the window at their young son, who was playing in the tall grass with a wooden horse Silas had carved. She looked at the garden they had planted over the scars of the earth. "The lead story," she said, her voice full of a peace that had taken a lifetime to earn, "is that the war is over, not just on paper, but in our hearts." The locket in the garden. As the sun set, Evelyn walked to the edge of the woods. She still carried the silver locket, the one Silas had buried and then reclaimed. She realized she no longer needed to wear it as a shield. She knelt by a flowering hawthorn tree and pressed the locket into the rich, dark soil. "Rest now," she whispered to the spirits of Jonas, Caleb, and the others. "The ink you spilled has grown into a forest." She returned to the cabin, where the hearth fire was roaring. Silas was sitting at the table, teaching their son the alphabet using the lead letters of the press. The Republic of the Soul. The narrative concludes with a wide-angle view of the valley. The blood of the revolution had been the high price of the land, but the ink of their love had been the title deed. They had realized that while the war was a collective struggle, the peace was a private victory. They had survived the traitors' ballroom, the frozen hills of Valley Forge, and the smoke of Yorktown to find this: a quiet house, a warm fire, and a future that didn't need to be written in code. The love story written in blood and ink had reached its final, perfect period. The final signature. The last page of the book is not a letter, but a legal document, the deed to their land. At the bottom, side by side, are two signatures. Silas Thorne, free man; Evelyn Thorne, free woman. Beneath the names, there is a single smudge of black ink, a deliberate mark left by Silas, a reminder that the printer would always be a part of the man. The story was done, the home was found, the ink was dry.